All right, perfect. So, basically the objective today is basically to continue on with our topic discussion from yesterday. What I want to do first is I want to play around a little bit with the template that we discussed yesterday, which was this simplified example of a financial model for recurring revenue businesses. And the reason why I want to play around with this example first is that I'm going to try to draw with the example, like, to illustrate quantitatively what some of the most important kind of intuitions about, for instance, revenue and more importantly, operating income dynamics are for these types of businesses and how they relate to some of the key parameter assumptions that we made in our underlying template. The most important thing that I want us to remember with recurring revenue businesses is when we're thinking about a company's operating income, as I said last lecture, right? Operating income today or in a given point in time for a recurring revenue business is basically a tug of war between two things, right? The positive operating income that comes from cohorts that you acquired in the past, because cohorts that you acquired in the past, right, are generating or should be generating marginal profits because you don't need to pay to acquire them anymore, right? So you're just kind of reaping the benefits of, loosely speaking, owning that customer, right? So that gives us kind of a positive effect on operating income. And then there's a negative effect, right, which comes from the customer acquisition costs from acquiring your new batch of customers, right? So the new cohort that you just acquire at that point in time, you're not necessarily, you're usually not getting any benefit from them right away because they pay you slowly over time, right? So for instance, with a company in the SaaS space, they're going to be paying you a per period fee at the end of each period, for instance. Or even if they're paying something up front, it's small relative to the customer acquisition cost. And so from that new batch of customers that you get a negative pull on your operating income, right? So you have these two effects, and whether operating income is positive or negative, and whether it's becoming more and more negative or becoming less negative or growing, is really entirely a function of which of those two effects dominate, right? What's more important, the revenue or the marginal profit that you get from past customers versus the amount that you pay in customer acquisition costs for your new customers? It's really a function of those two things. And once you understand that intuition, you can start to understand the patterns that we see in the data in terms of companies that are growing quickly, having negative operating income, and where that negative operating income is getting more and more negative over time, right? So in this case here, right, we lose $37 million, at time zero. Then we lose 65, then we lose 113, right? So our operating losses are growing over time, right? Why? Because the effect of the costs of acquiring a new customer dominate the effect of the marginal profits that we make from past customers. And the extent to which that latter effect dominates the former is getting larger and larger over time, which is why these losses keep getting larger and larger. Now, one thing that's useful in terms of intuition is to understand, well, once we think of it as these two levers, what are things that are going to tend to create a pattern of gains versus losses, and what's going to tend to create like less of a growing loss or more of a growing gain? So the first thing I said, remember we had some discussion of this in yesterday's lecture, was that like the cost of customer acquisition, how intense your cost of customer acquisition is going to have a huge impact on which of these two effects dominate. And you might remember that I said, look, we can think of two types of businesses, recurring revenue businesses that acquire customers primarily on a paid basis versus those that have more viral growth where they get a lot of their new customers for free, right? So I said, for instance, Twitter was an example of viral growth, so that most of their customers, they actually didn't have to pay any customer acquisition costs. By the way, my parameter here is CAC That's customer acquisition cost divided by revenue per user. So that just means for every dollar that the user gives you next year, you have to pay $1.3 today to get that user. So a company that has more viral customer acquisition would have a number here that's smaller, right? And so let's see what happens when we make this number smaller. When we make this number smaller, so again, think Twitter, right? So Twitter, because of viral customer acquisition, they didn't have to pay any CAC for most of their customers, right? So we would expect the average CAC per unit of revenue on a customer to be smaller than the average SaaS company. This 1.3 was actually taken from the average SaaS company, just so you guys know. As I said, anything in red denotes parameters that I chose from real world data. So I'm just gonna make this number go down. And let's see what happens to this pattern of losses when we make the number go down. So now let's make it go down to $1. So I'm just gonna press enter. And we can see now the losses aren't growing quite as much, right? That makes sense, right? When we think of it as these two levers, right? Balancing revenue from past users, that didn't change when we just changed this parameter. But what did change is our CAC went down because we lowered the amount of CAC that we need to pay per unit of increase in revenue next period. All right, so we can see that got less than 10. If we make it go down more, let's make it 0.5. 0.5, right? It's still growing, but right, it's not as common as before. If we make it sufficiently low, we're actually going to now flip into being profitable already because we barely need to pay customer acquisition costs. If we barely need to pay customer acquisition costs, the customer acquisition cost effect is not going to dominate the revenue from past cohorts effect. So let's say it was, 10 cents per revenue per period on a customer. So now I suspect what we'll see is that these operating income numbers now will be positive, right? And indeed they're positive. Another way to think about it is the smaller this number, the closer the pattern is going to look like a more traditional business than this high growth, costly customer acquisition, recurring revenue, where actually, we don't have profits, we have losses, and they keep getting worse and worse. More and more negative, I should say. Right, so this is important, like at an intuition level, I want you guys to understand why when I change this parameter, the change in the pattern of operating income was kind of intuitive, right? So because with these types of businesses, you want to kind of have a good intuitive handle on what the main drivers of the business are, and you want to have a quantitative handle where you can build and work with this type of financial model. You want to be able to do both. This discussion right now, where I'm changing these numbers, is primarily to build on intuition. I'm actually gonna push back button. By the way, another thing I'll mention is if you look at my spreadsheet now, what you'll see is when you highlight the red numbers, the spreadsheet I sent yesterday, I had typed in the number. Now the spreadsheet actually refers to this BVP sheet, which has all the underlying data. So what it allows you to do is if you want to kind of explore the spreadsheet yourself, this gives you a sense of where I got the red numbers from. Right, so I don't have the time to go in these kind of official lectures through every single detail of where I got numbers, but you can look at this and if you have any questions about it, I'm more than happy to explain the motivation behind all of that stuff. Okay, but this is meant to make it a little bit easier for you to understand, well, why did I assume, a margin of 25%, a CAC per revenue per user of 1.3, right? So it shows you like the data that I used to obtain that. Again, this is an example of something where it would be very natural in my next session that's kind of more office hour style. If you have that question, you just can come ask me in that session and I'll tell you exactly how I got all those numbers. But hopefully, well, just 1 second. But hopefully we kind of understand why changing this number changes the operating income. It's all about its effect of lowering the downward tug on operating income of cost of customer acquisition. So that's what this parameter impacts. And that's why we see, companies that have high customer acquisition costs and that are growing rapidly have this loss and increasing loss pattern. Again, it may feel like I'm repeating myself a lot here, but if there's like one intuitive thing for you to remember about recurring revenue businesses, it is precisely what I'm just saying now. Okay? Someone had a question?
Yeah, I do, Jiro. So yesterday you showed us a ratio is exactly the reverse. I believe revenue per customer divided by the acquisition cost per customer, right? You said the rule of thumb is like bigger than 3. So since you reverse the ratio, so the rule of thumb will be 1/3.
No. Okay. No, actually, so Bruce is asking a good question here. You might remember we had a discussion on unit economics last lecture where I said, hey, look at the customer level, right? In this example, right, to acquire a customer, we had to pay $260,000 at time 0. And then every period in the future, that customer would generate a marginal profit of 50,000, right? So think of like 50,000 in perpetuity because we assume the customer would stay with you forever, but wouldn't increase or lower their spend in this simple example, right? And so then I said, look, once we think of a customer like a sequence of cash flows like this, when we want to decide, is customer acquisition good or not, there's a few things that are useful to look at. One is do an NPV on this cash flow stream. That's easy, right? It's just perpetuity formula, 50 divided by the 10% discount rate, which is 500. That number, right, the net present value of the positive numbers here, the future benefits of having this customer, that's called LTV, or lifetime customer value, right? This is the CAC, right? So the net difference between those two things is the NPV of a customer. The NPV of a customer is 500 minus 260, 240. And then I talked about this LTV to CAC ratio, where I said, take the LTV, divide it by the CAC. In this case, it's 1.92. And what I said is, investors, when they're thinking of giving money to this kind of startup to fund their growth, which is basically to fund their sales and marketing expenses, they usually want this number to be bigger than 2 for like relatively low CAC businesses. And for high CAC businesses, especially enterprise SaaS, they usually even want the number to be bigger than 3. Now, what I want to point out is this number here is not the same as the inverse of this number here. I think that's what you were asking, Bruce, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're not the same. The reason they're not the same is, notice R per, that's revenue per period from the user, right? So that's only looking one period ahead, and it's not factoring in margins. Do we agree? Meanwhile, LTV is not just one period ahead, it's the NPV of all the future marginal profits, which is many periods, but factors in the margin, right? So the denominator here is 200. Meanwhile here, this number is not 200, it's 500, right? So those are different numbers. Now you might ask, am I trying to complicate your life or confuse you by switching those two things? The answer is no, it's doing different stuff, right? The reason why I do a unit economics is because it gives me a sense of like, look, are these customers that I'm acquiring, do they add value to my company or not? If this number is positive, the answer is yes. Whenever this number is positive, this number is bigger than 1, by the way. That's like a mathematical relationship. If this is 1, this is 0. right? Because if LTV is equal to CAC, NPV is just LTV minus CAC. So that's just a mathematical theorem. But this is really about assessing, like, is growth good? And the LTV to CAC ratio, as I had said last lecture, it kind of measures a margin of safety that you have on customer acquisition. It gives you a sense of how much worse can my unit economics get while still giving me good growth. Right? So, this says, look, the funnel could, like the customer acquisition, the customer dynamics could get a little bit worse, and this would still be a profitable, like customer acquisition would still be profitable, right? So for instance, I'll just randomly change the number here. Let's say things got worse, and now it didn't cost just 260,000 to acquire a customer. It now costs 400,000. Right? So getting new customers has gotten more difficult. Well, despite that, right, NPV of a customer is still positive, LTV to CAC ratio is positive. So that gives us a sense of, if we want to be funding future customer acquisition, how much can things get worse while still making it worthwhile for us to fund new customer acquisition? So that's what unit economics really is all about. Now this parameter here, CAC divided by revenue per user, this is an easier thing for us to empirically measure. Why is this easier for us to measure? In order to measure unit economics like completely accurately, we need to be able to forecast the whole dynamics of the customer, which means we need to actually take a stand on how long can we keep the customer and how will the customer spend change over time. In the real world, that's not an easy thing for us to do. But it is easy for us to see the customer signed up today and has committed to pay this much money over the next period. Right? Today, I already know that number. So this number is just easy for me to just look at data and know what that number is. That's why I use this parameter here within my model. So in any case, so what have we done so far? In playing with this template, we've kind of highlighted the single most important thing, which is when we make this number smaller, right? We get less of less losses in operating income, and we get less growth in the rate of loss in the short term. Now, the second most important thing to be comfortable with in these types of businesses is holding our customer acquisition cost fixed. Let's say that this CAC parameter is high enough so that we have a declining pattern like this. Well, if we increase the customer growth rate, what we're going to see is that this pattern is going to become more pronounced. Bigger losses, growing even more. Okay, so let's see this by just changing this parameter. So I'm just going to change this number from 75% to 100%. So the company is growing faster now. Now, since growth is good, what should happen to the value of the customer? The value of the company, intuitively. Getting customers is good. We're growing more. That should be good news. So the value of the company should go up. Do we agree with that statement? Right? That's pretty intuitive. What is not intuitive for some people is growth is going to go up. The company is going to go up in value because of that, right? So the increase in growth rate is good news. But look at what happens to my losses in the short term. The good news, let's see, good news, we make it 1, has now magnified the losses and made them grow even more over time. Right? So this, a lot of people find very counterintuitive, which is if you look at the pattern of losses of the company, the more aggressive those losses are and the faster they're growing is not, in this model, bad news. It's actually good news. So most people think this is the complete reverse of typical intuition. And the reason is increase in growth rate is going to increase your losses today because of the increase in CAC, but the benefit you're getting from those those extra customers you're getting only shows up slowly over time, and as a result shows up in the future.
Wouldn't a higher growth rate like make your CAC decrease? Like if your
Okay.
advertising or whatever is more effective, like you'd have less cost per customer.
Yeah, so let's be clear, like what I'm assuming. So this is always good, right? It's always good to understand in a model like this, especially the more stuff you add into the model, is like when you change one parameter, what are you actually assuming, right? Now, when I say the growth rate of customers goes up from 75 to 100%, I'm also assuming in my model that the sales and marketing expenses go up in lockstep, right? So I'm increasing the growth rate, but I'm also increasing at the same time the sales and marketing. So as a result, it's not like this is making my marketing spend more efficient. So I'm increasing the growth rate while preserving the same marketing efficiency. Make sense? I mean, I could have changed the assumption where I would hold my marketing costs fixed. And so as a result, when I increase my growth rate, exactly as you point out, the efficiency would go up, so the CAC divided by RPER would fall. But I wanted to kind of keep unit economics fixed in this example and really just focus solely on the effect of just the pace of growing customer base, holding the customer economics fixed. That was just my decision here. But it is, by the way, like you definitely, there is value in really kind of thinking carefully about your templates like this so that you really do understand when you change one parameter, what exactly are you changing? Right? So I'm actually quite happy that you asked that question. Because that's very deliberate in this model, that when I change that parameter, it's not changing customer level economics. I like in these models to separate out customer economics from customer growth patterns. So we can see, right, so
Professor.
But I'll just maybe one quick thing before I take your question, Esteban, is just notice that when I increased growth, I increased value, right? Because at 75%, this number was a little bit less than $1 billion. At 100%, the value went up, despite the fact that losses in the short term became even more negative, right? So this, in a very narrow sense, looks worse, but actually value went up. And the reason why value went up is that this wasn't actually bad news. It was actually a sign of good things to come, because now you've got more customers that are generating these goodies in the future, right? So these numbers went up. So sorry, Esteban, you can ask your question. I just wanted to kind of close that loop so that we understood that.
It's kind of like a comment. I just want to say it like, so the CAC/RPER.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, I know it represents 1.3 because, the cost of marketing is bigger than the 200. But what really matters is the PPER, right? Like what?
Well, it's both, right? It's right. Like when this number goes up, like the value of a customer is higher. When this number goes up, the value of a customer is lower. So it's not one or the other, it's both of them.
Okay. Oh, because the cost, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like just, right, the NPV of the customer is minus 260. What was 260? It was 200 times 1.3, right? Plus the perpetuity value of getting 50 in the future, so discounted by 10%. So both of those things matter. If you only look at one, you're not studying the customer correctly.
Okay, but the 200 are not very important for instance, on this example. Is it?
No, so that's not true at all, because actually the 200 here matters for both of these numbers, right? The 50 here was 200 scaled down by the margin, right? So this was 200 times our 25% margin. Meanwhile, the 260 was 200 times 1.3. So the 200 was affecting both of them. Right? So there's one other thing that I want to show. So a third thing, right? So what are the two things I've said so far? First thing I said is if we lower CAC divided by R per, the pattern of increasing negative cash flows becomes dampened, right? And if it's low enough, things become positive, looking a little bit more like a traditional business, right? So that was intuition / observation 1. Observation 2 was when unit economics are good and CAC is high, when we increase our growth rate, cash flows look worse in terms of their short-term pattern, but value goes up because the short-term increasing losses is actually a good sign of what's going to happen in the future. So that was observation 2. That's probably the most counterintuitive one. Now the third observation that I want to point out is about the role of unit economics, right? So what I want to show now is when unit economics are bad, this second observation, things looking bad in the short term are actually good news, is no longer true. And the intuition there is, well, the intuition of the first part was things look bad in the short term because CAC dominates past cohort marginal profits, but acquiring users are good because the unit economics of the user are good. Well, when the unit economics of a user are bad, then acquiring more of them is bad stuff. You're just doing more and more bad stuff. So that's going to destroy value. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change my one of my parameters to create negative unit economics. So where the NPV of a customer is going to be negative. Well, if the unit economics of a customer is negative, this is not a valuable company, right? Because it's just, it's got a bunch of negative value or it's acquiring a bunch of negative value users in the future. Its value might be positive because the users it acquired in the past are still generating value. So I'm going to create worse unit economics in this example. There's many ways to do it, but I'm just going to do it by lowering the margin. So I'm going to lower the margin from 25%. I'm not sure if 5% is going to do it. I think it will. Actually, I think it will. So I'll make this 5%. So what we want to pay attention to, this is going to change this entire model automatically. It's also going to change the unit economics. And the first thing I want to check is that this number is going to become negative. It is indeed negative. In fact, I won't make it even quite that negative. I'll make it 10% instead. I want to make it a number that this number's valuation is still positive. Some of this stuff I just need to do. Trial and error. Oh, no, that's too much. Okay, so 12.5%. Okay, so this is an example. I just kind of cherry picked a number here. I lowered the margin. Lowered the margin makes customers less valuable. And indeed, in this case, each customer we acquire in the future has an NPV of minus 10,000. So growth is bad here. In this model, growth is bad, but growth is still happening. And this is the value of the company. Notice, actually, growth is bad, but the value of the company is still positive. Does anyone have an intuition of why that's the case? If acquiring customers is bad, how can this company have positive value?
Because, go for it.
Go ahead.
Sure. I guess because the growth stops on t equals 6, and then.
So that's not the reason. The fact that growth stops at t equals 6 and 4 kind of limits the damage of bad growth, right? So it makes the negative pull on value less negative because at least growth doesn't continue forever, right? But that's not the reason this has positive value. We want to identify something that creates a positive pull on value. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Because of the old customers.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's exactly the reason, right? So even though growth is bad, the company still has positive value because at least it has those past customers that it doesn't need to pay for anymore that are generating positive profits. So the reason why this number is positive instead of negative is because the value, the positive value from past users, like slightly more than offsets basically the bad growth that we're planning to do in the future. Folks okay with this? So that's a useful intuition, by the way. One thing that's very important to keep track of in recurring revenue businesses is, it's always useful to think about how we can split the value of a company. Yesterday, we talked about splitting the value of a company across the different cohorts. A simpler split is just two groups: past cohort that we've already acquired and the cohorts that we're acquiring now and into the future. When growth is bad, but margins are still positive, that future group, right, acquire now or in the future, has negative value. But because our margins are still positive, at least the folks we've already acquired have positive value. So this is a useful split. It's useful to think, well, what value to the firm do the past users contribute, as Tony recognized, versus what value to the firm do all the future customers that we're getting generate. When growth is bad, this creates negative value, but this number is still potentially positive so long as this margin is still positive. Okay, but this is an example where growth is bad. And so now what I want to highlight, in this example where growth is bad, obviously now if I increase growth, what's going to happen to the value of the company? Unlike before when growth was good, increasing growth now is going to be a bad thing because we're basically destroying value more times. Yes? So we'll actually see this, right? So I'm going to change this to 1 just like before. But now what I want to draw our attention to is the value of the firm. Now the value of the firm is going to go down. Indeed, it went down. By the way, this is actually like an important practical point to take out of this, which matters for all recurring revenue businesses that are growing quickly, is that this makes life a little, like when you combine fact 2 with fact 1, remember fact 1 was when unit economics are good, increasing the growth rate will make losses look worse, right? But value goes up. So like cash flow is becoming more and more negative, more aggressively, is good news. But now what I've shown you is the exact opposite is true when unit economics are bad, when growth is bad. When growth is bad, increasing your growth rate is still going to make the cash flows look worse and worse. So this actually looks worse compared to the 75%. But now value goes down. And so when you're looking at a recurring revenue business like this that's growing quickly and has like important costs of customer acquisition, fact 2, you should not interpret that as meaning, oh, whenever I see growing losses, that's great news for the business. Because there's this huge caveat. That statement is only true if unit economics is positive. If unit economics are bad, seeing those losses get worse and worse is more intuitive. That's bad news. And it's making value go down, right? So maybe what I called fact 2 and fact 3, you should just think of it as 2 versions of fact 2. There's one version where unit economics are good. So growth is good. So seeing cash flows getting worse is actually good news. Version 2 of that pattern is when unit economics are bad, seeing the cash flows get worse and worse is indeed bad news. So in my mind, like these are the most important kind of intuitive things to always keep in the back of your mind when you're kind of trying to make sense of the patterns that you see for these types of businesses. Folks okay with this?
Jiro, I just had a question.
Sure.
I just wanted to know, can you use unit economics then as a way to kind of further delimit how big your total addressable market is for a product? Because, for example, let's say at a certain point it costs too expensive. Let's say at your 10th million customer, then your NPV for your unit economics is negative. Then you'd be able to say, okay, we've topped out on the market. It's going to be too expensive to try to grow business further.
Absolutely right. So I think of this almost more like like these Venn diagrams where these circles are partially intersecting kind of thing. So there's commonality between our unit economics calculation here and the question you're asking, right? Because absolutely, there's the total market, and then there's the share of the market that you can actually potentially acquire. And like the extent to which you can acquire market depends on how quickly your unit economics worsen. If they're going to worsen mega fast, then like you can't acquire that much of the market. Meanwhile, if the unit economics are not going to worsen at all, then you can keep on acquiring and increasing your TAM, like for a more extended period of time. So I would say they're related to each other. They're not exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But all of these things are kind of related to each other. So it's definitely helpful to think about, I would say, almost more like the dynamics of unit economics, right? So how we expect unit economics to change over time, to try to formulate an opinion on how far can we go in this market.
Okay.
And there's no doubt, like for a business like this, answering that question, like what do we think our long-term market share could potentially look like, is like an incredibly important question. Like the answer to that question, is gonna, like the value of this company is gonna be hugely dependent on that answer. Absolutely.
Hey, Jiro,
Yeah, go ahead.
So
Go ahead.
you mentioned the long-term value to CAC is like the unit economic ratio, right? So what kind of ratio is CAC to revenue per customer? Maybe what I'll do is I'll tell you why I actually use this parameter. There's a practical reason for it, which is it allows me to quickly model for a customer I acquire, how much did I have to pay for them up front? Because once I know this number and I know what R per is, I multiply the two numbers together and it gives me CAC. So that's one, is that makes it really easy to model these numbers in my model, right? Now, the other reason is related to data. So I might as well just tell you guys, right? So the reason why I focused on getting this number from data, again, I focused on getting it from data because it's red. That's the way to tell what I use data for, just for practical purposes. Okay, this is actually a bit of a mess to look at, so I apologize for that. What I have here is every single company that's part of the Bessemer Venture Partners Emerging Cloud Index. To me, it's the best source of data to try to come up with realistic parameters in my financial model. Okay, so that's kind of why I built this data set. This data set is built using the Excel Bloomberg add-in. So that spreadsheet I sent to you, if you guys open it on your own computer, it's going to say like numbers not provided or something like that, right? But if you open it on like the school computer after you've already launched Bloomberg Terminal, it's going to populate these numbers. But from Bloomberg, I'm able to get a bunch of information. I'm able to get information like revenue. I'm also able to get, well, what are my sales and marketing expenses on an annual basis? So far, so good. So to get the 1.3, what did I do? I just made the following quick back of the envelope calculation. I said, look, why don't I take a look at how much I spend in sales and marketing in 2015. And let me see how much my revenue goes up between 2015 and 2016, right?
So what I did is I spent about 1.7 billion. This is Adobe right here. Adobe spent about 1.7 billion in sales and marketing expenses in 2015. The following year, their revenue went up from 4.8 to 5.8 billion. So went up by 1 billion. I'm just going to make a simplifying assumption, which is that all of these dollars of marketing expense were about getting new customers now. And it's those new customers now that created the increase of 1 billion in revenue. I realize I see some people squinting forward, so obviously this is way too small. But does what I say kind of, like, you guys understand? I mean, hopefully there's some sense of what I'm trying to accomplish here, which is I look at how much spending I make in time T. And for that same company, I look at the change in revenue from time T to time T plus 1. That ratio I'm interpreting as this parameter. So all I did to get this 1.3 is I calculated that ratio for every company in the index for every year. And that's how I got the 1.3. That average was about 1.3. Now, the way I got this number makes a bunch of assumptions, right? So like, do I actually think that that's the real CAC to R per ratio? The answer is not really, and there's a few reasons for that. One is, like, essentially, maybe it's better to kind of mention under what set of assumptions that ratio, that calculation that I just told you, which is this number divided by the difference between these two numbers. Under what conditions would that number be exactly equal to CAC divided by R per? One set of conditions that would generate that exact relationship would be if every single dollar of sales and marketing at time T was solely to acquire customers at time T. So it wasn't to like, so there was no sales and marketing expense to kind of keep old customers. And there was no like sales and marketing expense to prime not customers that we get today, but customers that we get in the future because of reputation building or something like that. That's an assumption. Why do I make that assumption if it's not perfectly realistic? Because a more realistic model I can't get numbers for. Okay, so you know that's part of life with financial modeling is we need to make some simplified metrics because we don't have the benefit of all the information in the world. And then the other assumption here is that whole 4.8 billion in revenue next period from the past cohorts is not changing next period, so that every dollar increase in revenue is coming from new customers. Okay, so if those two assumptions were true, that back of the envelope calculation that I just mentioned, take this number divided by the difference of these numbers, would mathematically be exactly equal to that CAC divided by R per ratio. Again, this just kind of goes back to this thing where I think it's important when you build a model, a financial model like this, you want to think carefully about the assumptions you're making when you kind of try to plug in some of these parameters off of data. And you understand when you change this parameter, exactly what are you assuming about everything else in your model. Like, you know, I think building a habit of logically keeping track of this stuff as you build a model like this is important.
I have a question. What if you spend in a certain year on operating expenses and your revenue rather than growing decreases? So in this case, it's like marketing.
Sorry, can you repeat that? There was a bit of static for a second, so I think I missed a couple of the keywords.
Yeah, if your revenue between time T plus 1 and T equals 0 decreases rather than increasing, while your operating expenses are still getting are still positive, this is like you're considering you're doing marketing for, and you're losing customers rather than adding customers.
Yeah. So maybe what I'll do is I'll add some commentary to what you just said, which is like, if I see a company have declining revenue, like to me, the first thing I would say to myself is that the back of the envelope calculation that I just told you, I don't believe it. Like, I don't think it's giving me like this number. Because the fact that revenue went down, even though I spent money to get new customers, suggests that like I've lost some of my old customers, or some of my old customers aren't spending as much anymore, right? Because if they were still there and they're still spending as much, revenue cannot go down, right? So the fact that revenue goes down just means that like the basic assumption I made in the back of the envelope calculation is probably particularly erroneous. So I need to think more carefully about this. And I would start thinking about, okay, I should model how much customers I'm losing and what their change in spend is, which I just punted on.
Because you cannot just assume that they're losing customers. Maybe, as you said, it's customers paying less. So it's either one of the assumptions that not
which, by the way, we will, like extension 2 that I'm going to be doing here. So you can see there's simple example. This is written small. I can't magnify this, but simple example. Then you have extension 1, extension 2. In extension 2, I'm going to be thinking about customer dynamics of it. So I'm going to be thinking about, well, how many customers do I lose? And the customers I keep, how do they change their spend? And whenever you want to build a serious model for recurring revenue businesses, you want to take a stand on those 2 numbers. Sound good?
Thank you.
No problem. I see a couple of other residual hands up, so I might as well, I'll take you guys one at a time. So Andrew, you have a question? Oh, maybe no question anymore. That's all right. Ryan, you have a question? I just see that you're good. All right, lower your hand. Oh, I can actually lower your hand for you. Interesting. Umang, do you have a question, or is just you didn't lower your hand?
I didn't lower my hand. Sorry about that.
Okay, that's all right. Now that I'm looking at the screen, I figured I would try to take all the hands up symbols that I see. Okay, so I mean, this basically summarizes what I wanted to discuss for just kind of going through a bit more detail, connecting this model to intuition and like important key drivers of value for recurring revenue businesses. Everything that I highlighted right now, right? So also applies in more realistic examples, right? It's just like, to me, this is the easiest example to highlight that intuition. It's not only the case because I've ignored some factors. And indeed, like in terms of factors that have been ignored so far in the simple example, right? If you recall, I had assumed company pays no taxes, no capital expenditures, and no working capital. Obviously, that's not realistic. If we want to build a more rigorous valuation, we need to forecast out not just operating income, but every component of the cash flow equation. I'm going to assume we're comfortable with the cash flow equation, right? So cash flow at time t equals, 1 minus tax times operating income, where operating income is pre-tax here. That's the way I calculated it. Plus tax times depreciation minus CapEx minus change in working capital. So presumably we're all comfortable with that. And so this is telling us, in order for us to get cash flow, it's not sufficient for us to just do what we did here, which was get operating income. We need to get also CapEx, depreciation, working capital, which will allow us to get change in working capital. And from there, we're going to be able to get our cash flows. So we know we're going to need to do that, right? And our example so far hasn't done that. Our next example is going to incorporate that additional realism. Okay, so we're going to add this into our model. Other things that we have left out in the simple example the other one that we've pointed out as being important in several questions so far, is thinking more carefully about customer dynamics, right? So in particular, right, what we've assumed so far in customer dynamics is you get a customer, you keep them forever, and they don't change. Like the marginal profit that you make from them doesn't change over time. That's like super, simplified, most cases not realistic. It's kind of like a cartoon model. If we want to make the model more realistic, we want to model those dynamics more carefully. So we want to model, well, at what rate do customers that we obtain stop becoming customers? The term that's used in practice for that is the customer churn rate. So the churn rate is, look at your customers this period, what percentage of them drop from now to next period, that's the churn rate. So if you've got a churn rate of 20%, that means one customer is expected to be 0.8 customers next year. And if that churn rate is constant over time, then one customer today, 2 years from now is expected to be 0.64 customers, right? 0.8 times 0.8. Because of the remaining 80%, another 20% would drop off between year 1 and year 2, so on and so forth. So we need to model customer churn. Sorry, 1 second. And then the other thing we need to model to really understand customer level dynamics is also to think, well, look, if we're lucky enough to keep a customer, do we still get $50,000 in marginal profit from them? Or does that number change? Does it go up? Does it go down? In some cases, it can go up. In some cases, it can go down. Reasons that it could go up is, they start using your product more broadly, right? So maybe if this is enterprise SaaS, right? So it's a business that starts using your cloud software product. Well, maybe over time, they start onboarding more of their employees to use your product, and you earn more money from them because of that. Or maybe you're able to upsell them to more premium versions of your product, right? So there are a variety of reasons why when you keep a customer, they can be spending more and more over time. And maybe it could also be that your margins improve over time because as you grow, you've got, you're just kind of, you've got economies of scale or something. Flip side is actually the economics could get worse, right? So the amount of marginal profit that you get from a customer could go down over time. For instance, if there's, more competition in your market, and so you need to lower your price in order to keep your customers, right? So those dynamics can go either way, but we would like to model them in a given scenario to do this valuation correctly. So that's something that we need to do in practice. We need to model our customer churn, and for the companies, customers we keep, at what rate does the marginal profit from them either go up or go down? So we need to model those two things. We're actually going to combine those two things into one number called the dollar retention rate. So that means for every dollar of marginal profit this period, how much marginal profit do we expect next period when we factor in both loss of customers and changes in remaining customers. Dollar retention rate is one of the most important metrics that recurring revenue businesses focus on when they're looking at customer level economics. So it's basically this number and CAC that are the things that matter the most for these businesses. But again, we didn't make any attempt to model this in our example so far. In extension 2, I will model this a little bit more carefully. And in extension 1, I'm going to incorporate this. Okay, so we're going to do this in extension 1, and in extension 1, we'll do both this and this. So I'm going to layer this on top of this. There's other things that I'm actually not going to put into extensions for now, but they can be modeled. It just kind of makes the spreadsheet more and more elaborate, which is, one is this question of more realistic long-term. Right, oh, actually, this can be interpreted in many ways. I am actually going to incorporate this both into extension 1 and extension 2, because more realistic long-term, what I highlighted here is we assumed 0 customer acquisition. beyond a certain date, starting year 7 and beyond in our example, I'm actually going to drop that assumption in a very specific way in both extensions. And I'll explain in what way I'm doing that. I'm not going to directly be times 7 and beyond model my, how many customers I acquire. Instead, I'm going to incorporate that long-term growth by doing a terminal value for my valuation model for the company, right? So, right, you do cash, you say value today is equal to the NPV of the first T cash flows plus terminal value at time T discounted by T periods. And we'll get the terminal value in a very specific way that I think is informed by real world data as well. Other considerations that we aren't going to model is things like modeling how margins change over time, for instance. So for young companies, we actually very much expect their margins to change over time. Usually, in an ideal context, they're getting better because of economies of scale. We're not going to model that at all here, right? We could, and actually modeling time-varying margins is something that you guys should be comfortable with, both in recurring revenue examples, but also for traditional businesses, especially high growth ones, right? So maybe that's something we can discuss in the future if you guys want to have something like that. But I'm not going to tackle that extension here. Yes, Noah, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do these models ever include a provision for like the risk that the technology becomes obsolete before the company starts becoming profitable?
Well, maybe what I'll do, that's a great question, actually. And what I'll do is I'll actually answer a more general question that incorporates your question.
Okay.
Which, the more general question, which actually I think hits the heart of the matter, like more in the heart or something, I don't know what the word for this would, like really hits the heart of the matter best, is like, do these models incorporate disruption risk? This idea that like, who knows, with this company, okay, fine, they're offering like the new hot enterprise SaaS product for HR software.
Yeah, it's fine.
Fabulous, wonderful. But who knows, maybe like in 10 years, that next generation of amazing, much better HR software is going to be developed by someone else. And all of our customers are going to be like, see ya, we're going to that new entrant. And our company gets like mega disrupted. And does this model, the way that I showed it to you, model that? The answer is no, period, full stop. Now, whether that happens before my company becomes profitable or not, it's an interesting version of that question, but whether that may happen in the future, regardless of whether it happens before I become profitable or after I become profitable, is like enormously important. Now, if there's a possibility of disruption, what do you think happens? If we were to model the possibility of disruption, what do you think would happen to the value of this company, given the way that we've modeled things? Would it go up or go down?
It would go down.
It would go down, right? That was right. That's not a subtle question, right? It's like here we're assuming we keep our customers forever. If we get disrupted, we don't keep them forever. So if we don't keep them forever, what happens to the value of the customer? It goes down because we don't get those 50s forever. They stop at some point. So that instead, in valuing our LTV, we shouldn't value it as a perpetuity. We should like maybe value it as an annuity that stops in 10 years because in 10 years we think we'll be disrupted, right? So absolutely, like, should we model that? The answer is absolutely yes, especially if we think this is a company that could get disrupted, right? If there's like limited switching costs for customers, for instance, no doubt. And in that case, this model systematically overvalues the company, full stop. And like that number can be enormous in terms of the overvaluation. When we do our VC course, I'm actually going to give you guys an exercise that actually has you guys come up with that realization through additional modeling. So no doubt that matters. No, I'm not even going to tackle that question in my extensions. So when I say more realistic long-term here, your question is another example of modeling a more realistic long term? Do we want to model disruption risk? The answer is we would love to. I'm also going to give you like an unfortunate additional practical realization, which is I would love to formulate a solid opinion on how large disruption risk is. Because I need to formulate that opinion in order to model disruption risk, right? So I need to take a stand. Oh, I think I'll lose my customers in 10 years. Well, where do you get that 10? Like right now, I just pulled it out of a hat. It's just a random number that I just stated. But what's a realistic horizon for disruption for a recurring revenue business? Like we don't have historical data that really tells us that question because as we discussed last lecture, the rise of recurring revenue in SaaS is a pretty modern phenomenon. It only happened really over the last 10 years. So if these companies can hold on to their customers for 10 years, none of them have really been disrupted yet. And if disruption has never happened, it's tough to try to decide how long it's going to take for disruption to occur. So right now, we don't have great data to model your question well. However, we do, like I definitely agree that we would love to be able to model it. And so what does that mean? We should pay attention to the world going forward to try to get snippets of information on how big that disruption risk is, right? So I don't have a great way to get that number out of historical data, but I do know I need to think about that number. And if there is any data that pops up in the future that informs on that number, I want to keep track of it, right? So it gives me food for thought for improving my, maybe not food for thought, but it allows me to recognize what do I need to pay attention to improve my model in the future, even though I can't really improve it right now because I don't have the data to allow me to make a comfortable decision there. Make sense? By the way, that's something that I always think about with any model that I want to build, right? I ask myself, like, what would I really like to know that I do not know right now? Because I don't know it right now, like, I can't really seriously model it at the moment, but I know that I want to try to learn about this to model it in the future because I do want to evolve and improve my models over time. So again, that goes back to this thing of like, you really want to be comfortable with your models. You want to know the assumptions you're making, right? You want to know exactly what you've been assuming so that you can know, well, when do I want to change this? Or you want to revisit your assumptions on a periodic basis. Like, okay, in the past when I valued this company, I assumed A, B, and C. A year later, let me see, like, do the new facts that have arisen over the last year kind of invalidate A, B, or C? Or are things still looking kind of sensible? So definitely kind of a good discipline habit. And again, if you have the habit of doing this over time, you're going to be improving your models over time much better than someone who doesn't do this in a disciplined manner, right? So it's something that gives you an edge today, but it's something that gives you a growing edge over time in your career in terms of making sound, financial modeling decisions, investment decisions, yada, yada, yada. All right. So let's start going over some of these extensions. So just like yesterday, it looks like I'm going to be going a lot over time. So look, I understand some of you guys have to leave. You have to leave. I'm sorry that some of this goes over. What I will do is I will give you guys the videos of all these examples. So even if I have to lecture to no one towards the end of the second extension. And I am going to separate the videos where it's like discussion of simple example, coverage of extension 1, coverage of extension 2. So that like it can be easier for you if you leave to kind of not watch stuff that you already watched or something like that. Sound good? All right, so let's go over extension 1. As I said, extension 1, we're going to take our simple example and we're going to add realism specifically by doing 2 things: modeling out the other component of cash flows, taxes, CapEx and depreciation, and working capital stuff. And we're also going to cover that bullet point, one aspect of the bullet point of modeling the long term better by allowing the possibility of future growth after time 6, which in our simple example, we had assumed it was 0. Now we're not going to assume it's 0. Instead, we're going to get a terminal value for the company at time 6 using a multiples-based approach. Okay? So those are the things that we're going to do in this example. Now, of course, we need to pick numbers to be able to incorporate all of these additional factors that I mentioned. So in our extension example, we've got everything that we had in the simple example, except we drop one thing, the 0 growth after time 6 assumption. We no longer assume that anymore, okay? But everything else that was stated in the simple version, we're continuing to assume, and we're adding the following assumptions. We're going to assume that the company pays an effective tax rate of 10%. These are US companies, so we know the statutory tax rate currently I think is 21%. This number is lower because companies can do a bunch of things to lower their tax bill. I'm going to assume 10%. Where did I get that? I got that from the average of the companies in the BVP Emerging Cloud Index. So all of these numbers I'm actually getting from that BVP data. Okay, so my point being, like, these numbers aren't taken out of thin air. I did try to anchor them to the real world a bit. So I'm assuming I'm going to use an effective tax rate of 10%. I'll apply the effective tax rate instead of the statutory tax rate. Some people differ in their judgment about which they use. Maybe at a later date we can talk a little bit about what governs some of that debate, like, you know, when might it be better to use one versus the other, and how you change your model as a function of that. But in this context, I'm going to use the effective tax rate. To model capital expenditures, I'm going to make the following assumption. For every dollar of expected revenue increase from time t to time t plus 1, the company needs to invest $0.2 in CapEx at time t. So what's the logic between thinking behind thinking about things in this way? So notice what I'm doing here. I am modeling CapEx today in relationship to the expected increase in revenue from now to next period. Now, if we think about it, why do you make CapEx today? The primary reason you make CapEx is to increase your production capacity, right? How much do you need to increase production capacity? It depends on how much more business you expect to be doing next period. So the increase in business activity, i.e. revenue, from this period to next period should govern how much CapEx you need to do right now. And that's basically what I'm going to be using that relationship or that thinking to try to model how high CapEx needs to be. So by the way, so general statement, I suspect you guys have already seen this with some of Vadim's stuff, is when you want to model your cash flows, the first thing you start by doing is you model your forecasted revenue. We've already done that, right? Because we modeled, like, how much does each customer pay? How many customers do you have? So we've already forecasted revenue. And then usually every other component of the cash flow equation, we forecast as a function of revenue numbers, so that we use our revenue forecasts as a key driver of all the other cash flow components, right? So in particular, this is telling me how I forecast capital expenditures as a function of my forecasted revenue. Where did I get this 0.2? I also got that from the BVP Emerging Cloud Index. So I computed the historical relationship between next period revenue change and this period CapEx. And this is basically the average over all those companies over the 5 years, fiscal year 2015 to 2019. Okay. So, and we'll see how we use this number to forecast cash flows in our template in a second. Depreciation, I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to assume that we depreciate any capital expenditures on a straight line basis over 10 years down to salvage value of 0. Okay, so I'm going to assume that. And I'm going to assume working capital today is equal to 30% of next period forecasted revenue. So notice, I'm forecasting, just like with CapEx, I'm forecasting my working capital off of my revenue forecast as a key driver. And again, where did I get this 30%? I get the 30% from, again, I sound like a broken record, but it just highlights how you can get these numbers in the real world is I got it from the BVP Emerging Cloud Index as well. So what I did is I used historical data to compute this 0.2 ratio and this 30% and this 10% off of the historical financials of all of these companies that I view as being relatively similar to mine. Sound good? For completeness, I'm gonna, go ahead.
I'm not sure if it's just me, but your screen is not shared on my computer. So I see you talking, but like I cannot see your Excel spreadsheet.
Can anyone else not see? But can you see my slides?
No, I'm just seeing you, like I'm just seeing the video of you talking, but not your slides nor. Okay, I guess it's just me because someone is saying that it works for them. So.
Okay, I'm guessing like you're only seeing like, I have no idea.
I'm only seeing the video, you know?
Okay,
like,
I'm sorry. Maybe just open the spreadsheet that I sent. It's maybe the best we can do.
Maybe try to figure
or
out.
you know what? Okay, I'm gonna do the following. So I'm sorry that this is gonna slow things slightly. I'm gonna try stop sharing and resharing and hopefully it pops up for you. If it doesn't, I'm kind of at a loss because Zoom is a black box to me. Sound good?
Yeah.
No problem. So I'm gonna stop share and immediately reshare for everyone. Stop share. And now I'm going to start sharing again. Were you able to see it before?
Yeah, now it's working, and yes, I was able to see it for the simple example, but not since I don't know. Yeah, like
So, yeah.
minutes ago I stopped seeing.
Yeah, the reality is this is a myth, right? It's a mystery to all of us, but at least it works now.
Maybe when you
and I'll assume it works for everybody. So if anyone is not seeing it, like please just kind of unmute and just let me know. But these assumptions I've been making so far, this is what's going to help me forecast all the other components of the cash flow equation, except I'm going to need one more assumption, which is this information here doesn't tell me what depreciation today is. I'm going to assume depreciation today, so depreciation at time 0 is equal to 10% of forecasted revenue at time 1. Again, how did I get that number? I also got it from the BVP Emerging Cloud Index, historical financial of all of those companies. So this is what's going to help me tackle the comprehensive cash flow calculation thing that I wasn't considering in the simple example. Now, in order to tackle this more realistic long-term, specifically non-zero customer acquisition, starting time 7 and beyond. Again, just to reiterate, that doesn't, the extent to which it tackles your question, Noah, about long-term disruption risk is something that we could debate a little bit. But in terms of long-term customer growth, the way that I'm going to incorporate that, I'm not going to model the cash flows in that longer term. So I'm only going to focus on modeling from time 0 to time 6. But for valuation, I'm going to try to capture all that growth from time 7 and beyond, just using a multiples-based valuation. And the multiple I'm specifically going to use here is going to be EV to revenue. So notice it's not EV to EBITDA, it's EV to revenue specifically. The reason why I'm not using EBITDA here is these companies are still losing money. So EBITDA doesn't make sense to use. So in fact, if you look at the main multiple that's used for SaaS companies, for instance, it's EV to revenue. Why? Because revenue is positive. It doesn't make sense to use a denominator in multiples that's negative, right? So, so that's why I'm using EV to revenue. I'm using 13.9 as my EV to revenue multiple. If you're wondering where I got that, I looked at all of the companies in the BVP index, and I calculated the median of that whole group, the median of their EV to revenue multiples. So that median is 13.9. So that's where this number comes from, right? And remember, like, this multiple comes from forward-looking prospects of future growth, among other things, right? One of the things that I think Vadim discussed with you guys when discussing multiples is where do multiples come from? And one of the drivers of multiples is future growth. So if we think about the long-term growth of this company, when I say long-term growth, I mean ×7 and beyond. If we think their growth rate is going to be in line with what the average growth rate is for the BVP companies right now, then maybe using their multiple for our company six years from now is a sensible thing to do. Again, that assumes that our company in 6 years is going to be comparable to the BVP emerging cloud index companies today. That's an assumption. Folks okay with that? So now we will incorporate these two things into our valuation. And actually, I'm going to do two valuations. I'm going to do one. The two valuations are going to make slightly different, subtly different assumptions. So the first one is I'm going to assume I can use this 13.9 as my multiple to get a terminal value at ×6. And that basically means in 6 years, we think our company is going to be similar to these BVP emerging cloud index companies right now. And then the second valuation I'm going to do is I'm going to assume instead of using the multiple at ×6, that we should use this 13.9 as our multiple for valuing the company, not at ×6, but instead at ×3. Now, why am I talking about ×6 and ×3? I'm assuming it, we had discussed this yesterday, but in this hypothetical example, I'm assuming that the company is going public in 3 years. So ×3 is a special date. It's the IPO date. And ×6 is like, 3-4 years after the IPO date. And it makes a difference whether we apply this multiple at ×6 or ×3, and I'll highlight that via explicit mathematical calculations slowly, so that we can, again, further develop our intuition on what sort of assumptions we're making when we're using these using these models and using these multiples for getting terminal values. Sound good? So let's go to the spreadsheet. So now we're going to extension 1. So in this model, everything here, this part is identical to what I've already done. Okay, so I'm not changing. Nothing has been changed. Almost nothing has been changed in this part relative to our simple example. There's only, I think there may have been one thing that got changed. I'm going to just check just to make sure. Sorry, I just want to make sure I don't quote something that is fully. It's 51, 156. Oh, okay. So actually, no, nothing has changed in this part. I realize this is probably too small for folks, so I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So here, nothing has changed. Now you might say, well, wait a second, the numbers look a little bit different. I did change one parameter. I changed the growth from ×7 to ×10 to 20%. So I'm assuming non-zero growth from ×7 to ×10. We will see this is going to be irrelevant for our valuations, but it's going to be relevant for talking about future multiples. So I'll revisit. That's why I put it in green. I put it in green just to highlight, like, I changed this number relative to the previous example. And I've added a bunch of parameters, right? The CapEx divided by next period change in revenue, the depreciation over 10 years. That means we depreciate 10% per year. These were all the numbers that I stated in my statement of the extension 1 problem. Okay, so now given these numbers, to get my cash flow forecast and to get my valuation, the first thing I'm going to do, no problem, Andrew. The next thing I need to do is just get each of my cash flow components. So I'm going to want to, just like I have, a column for revenue, a column for the operating income on each of my cohorts, I'm going to want to create a column for my CapEx, a column for my depreciation, right? Because I need to have those things in order to get my cash flows. So how am I getting each of these components? So I'm just using the statement on the slide that I showed a second ago. So what this is saying is my CapEx at time 0 is what? It should be 20% of the increase in revenues between time 0 and time 1. Again, remember what the logic for that was. The more I expect to grow over the next year, the more I need to invest in CapEx today to be able to fulfill that growth. Right? So that's the model I'm assuming here. By the way, this is not the only model that we can use to forecast CapEx, but it's a very common one. Right? So, right, where does this this is 7.7 million about? Where does the 7.7 million come from? It comes from the fact that we expect revenue to go up from 51 to 90 million. So that's increasing by about 40 million. And for every dollar of revenue increase, we need to invest 20 cents in CapEx. So 20% of the 40 million increase is about 8 million. So that was where this number came from, right? So we can just double click and see that, right? The difference between these two numbers times this number. That's how we got our CapEx. And I just apply that formula everywhere, right? So this is the difference, right? This is 20% of the difference between time 2 and time 1. Right, I did it formula style, so I was just, all I did is I just dragged that formula. That's how I got all these numbers. So far, so good?
Jiro, I'm sorry,
Yeah, no
to
problem.
zoom in because it's really hard to see.
Oh, sorry. Is this a bit better?
Yeah,
It's like it's this trade-off between seeing something versus seeing everything.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Micro versus macro, no problem. Depreciation at time 0, I forecast as follows. I had just stated it in the problem, which was 10%. I said it was 10% of next period revenue. I explicitly stated it in the problem. In the real world, you would know what your depreciation right now is, right? I'm just telling you where I got this number. So 10% of next period revenue. Next period revenue is 89.6 million. So this is 8.96 million. 8.96 million. And then the next step that I want you guys to pay attention to is how do I get all my future depreciations? Well, my depreciation next period is going to be my depreciation this period, because everything that I was depreciating last period, I'm still depreciating this period. I'm assuming this is a young company, so it hasn't fully stopped depreciating any of its assets, right? And if that's the case, if we're straight line depreciating, any dollar we depreciated last period, we still depreciate today. But we depreciate additional dollars because of the CapEx that we made last period. We made 7.7 million in CapEx last period. We depreciate that 7.7 straight line for 10 years. That means we depreciate, in addition to this 8.9 million, 10% of that number. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so that's how I got this 9.7. It's what I depreciate at time 0 because I still do another round of that depreciation plus 10% of my CapEx from last period because I depreciate that number for the first time here. And then what happens at time 1? It's again, what I depreciated the period before plus 10%, right? 1/10 because of 10-year depreciation of what I CapEx the period before. So this is a formula, right? And it's meant to make my depreciation numbers in column Q consistent with my CapEx numbers from column P. So that's where that comes from. And everything else is just the same formula. previous depreciation plus, right, 1 over depreciation length times previous period CapEx. It's just that's our formulaic depreciation numbers, right? So to get these depreciation numbers, all we needed was depreciation at time 0, the series of CapEx, and assumption of the length of our depreciation schedule. That's how I got all of those. Working capital is straightforward to get, right? Because I had stated in the problem, it's 30% of next period revenue. So all this is our 30%. The cell B17 is just working capital divided by forward just means next period revenue, forecasted revenue, right? That 30%, I had just stated that in the problem. If you want to see where that comes from, this cell refers to something in the BVP spreadsheet, so you could look at it there. And then we've got of the next period revenue, which is 89.6 million. That gives us our working capital at time 0. I do the same calculation for every subsequent year by using the next period revenues, and that gives us our working capital over time. And then I, off of this, compute my change in working capital numbers. Right? Change in working capital is just this period working capital minus last period working capital. Now you might wonder, well, actually, how can you get the working capital, the change in working capital at time 0, given that you don't have working capital from a year ago? Well, I actually can get it. If I assume it's 30% of working capital, I take 30% of revenue today, that's working capital last year. And so you'll see this cell was a little bit different. I just took this number minus 30% of this year's revenue. And then off of that, I just compute. This is just the cash flow equation, right? 1 minus my effective tax rate of 10% times my operating income minus my CapEx plus my depreciation, depreciation tax shield, so tax times depreciation, minus my change in working capital. This is just a cash flow formula. And so off of that, I now have my cash flow forecast. One thing that I should mention is in generating my cash flow forecast up to time 10, I did assume that from time 7 to time 10, we've got 20% growth in customer instead of 0% growth, as I said earlier. But that gives us these sequence of cash flows. Yes?
I got a question. So yesterday you used like NPV at time 0 to arrive at like a stock price. So here we just assume depreciation is there and the capital expenditure is there and the tax is there. That's why we do the, okay. And my other question would be the N multiple, like you use EV to revenue. Is that solely because our operating income is negative? Only revenue is positive? Is that only reason, or in the recurring revenue business?
It's basically 2 reasons. One is because EBITDA is negative, and 2, because for these types of, so for companies that are high growth and currently are losing money, the norm, like the most common multiple to use is with revenue in the denominator, right? Something to sales, something to revenue multiple. Like that is the usual, like that's the usual suspect as a multiple. Is when your company is losing money right now, right? You try to find, you try to find a sensible set of comparables to use on a denominator is revenue basis.
Okay.
Now, can you use other stuff? Yes, you can, but this is the most standard one.
Okay. And what about working capital last year? If you don't have a forecast revenue, like here.
Oh, but what I said. Yeah. So what I said is working capital today, like at time t, is equal to 30% of revenue at time t plus 1. So if I want to get I apply this formula to t equals -1. Working capital at time -1 is equal to 30% of revenue at time 0. And I do know what revenue at time 0 is.
Okay.
That's all I did. Okay. So I was just kind of being self-consistent here. But that gives me my estimated cash flows, right? Minus 51 million, followed by minus 91 million, followed by minus 160 million, right? Eventually it peaks out at a minus 331 million. And hey, this company's burning a lot of money, right? So they need to be able to raise capital. And notice its cash flows still continue to be negative at time 7 to time 10, because I now assume some continued growth. Now these cash flow numbers I'm not going to use in my valuation at all. Okay, so another way to put it is I don't need to take a stand on that 20%. I just put 20% there for illustration purposes here. Sound okay? So this wraps up the part of our extension where we forecast out our cash flows. Now we want to do the part of our extension where we do our valuation, right? So we're going to use our cash flow numbers for our valuation. But as I said, the valuation we're going to do here is we're going to use early stage cash flows, but then we're going to tack on a continuation value after our core forecasting period, which in my first valuation is going to be 6 years. So I'm going to use my cash flow times 0, 1, all the way up to times 6. I'm going to NPV those, and I'm going to add to that a terminal value at times 6 discounted by 6 years. We're all comfortable with that, right? I'm pretty sure any valuation that you guys have seen in a template has done this terminal value approach. If you're not comfortable with it, more than happy to discuss it more carefully, more slowly, to you individually at some point, either my whatever Zoom office hour for this stuff, or just in general. Like if you have questions in general about some of these concepts, do not hesitate to email me and I will meet with you guys, okay? Because I want to make sure everyone is comfortable with this stuff. Or even stuff that Vadim has covered in other stuff, I'm happy to try to help with. I don't want anyone to fall behind over time.
Jiro, I've got a question.
Go ahead.
So for
Right,
the for CapEx at the last year, capital expenditures, how, because the formula for the last year's capital expenditure is different. I want to know how we get
I'm
that.
sorry, can I just need to go check one thing. Actually, I don't think there's anything. Just 1 second. Sweetie, are you here? Okay, good. She's not. I'm getting a call from someone for a meeting that she had to do, so I'm guessing she has. Anyway, I don't need to share that information. Okay, can you go back to your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So for the capital expenditure for the last year, the formula is a little bit different. I'm wondering how we get that
for the. Oh, man, I'm happy that you're checking it. Sorry. This is actually something I was kind of skipping, but it's actually good that you pointed out. So, who is it? Ken? Ken, you were the one who mentioned this?
Yeah, for capital expenditure.
Yeah. So actually, the formula that I just said in words for you guys changes in my last period number. There's a very specific reason that it changes, because remember, like this is 20% of next period change in revenue. Yes? Ken? We're on the same page there, right? So our formula before, 20% of next period change in revenue, which next period change in revenue is easy because it's just column B is our revenue column in this spreadsheet. So this is just saying revenue, 1 row down, minus revenue this row. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Well, notice like we can't do revenue 1 row down at the end of our forecast because we don't have a number there, right?
Yeah.
So I just like calculated the number myself because I know my revenue next period is going to be what? The number of customers that I have times the revenue per customer. So I just constructed my own. I could have done it another way, which is I could have just, forecasted out revenue 1 extra period. Sorry, I saw a message, so it's tough for me to think about 2 things at once. But yeah, so like I could have, another alternative, I could have used the send formula here, but forecasted out my revenue not to time 10, but to time 11. that would be identical. Sound good?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so now I have my cash flow numbers. Let's go ahead and do a valuation with this, right? And I'm going to be using terminal values. And I'm going to use a terminal value, I said, right? I said do two valuations. Valuation one, assuming the terminal multiple applies for getting a terminal value at time 6. We'll do that one first, okay? So how do we do that? I mean, you can decide what to do first, but the way that I like to do it is step 1, I get my terminal value at time 6. What's my terminal value at time 6? It's that multiple that I said to use, 13.9, times what? Revenue at time 6. So let's see. Revenue at time 6, about 750 million, times the multiple, 13.9. That gives me the value that I think I'll have at time 6, because at time 6, I think I'll have 750 million in revenue, and I think my company is going to trade at a 13.9 multiple on revenue. Now, that makes a very important assumption. I think in 6 years, my company is going to be comparable to the average BVP emerging cloud index company. That is an assumption. If that assumption isn't true, well, you know, we're making a systematic mistake in the multiple we apply for our company at that time. So that's an assumption we're making. Folks, okay so far? Yeah.
Professor, I have a question actually. With this multiple, the 13 more, can you go to the left?
Yeah.
Yeah, with this term multiple, the EV slash revenue, is it true that the bigger it is worse for the company, because then there is a big expectancy for these companies compared to the revenue?
I mean,
Or
yeah, I guess it's it depends on your perspective. Like, basically what you're saying is like, look, mathematically, this number goes up, your valuation goes up, which is a good thing. But you're right. The higher your valuation right now, the more pressure you've got to perform in the future. So I guess you can think of it. You can think of it both ways. Like, oh, fabulous, this is worth a lot. Oh shit, I need to like do well in the future.
I mean, like if your competitors have like a similar revenue, but this EV rev is way higher than your competitors, I guess it's bad for you because you have to perform way better than them, right?
I mean, again, I'll just restate, like, it's good for you because your holdings in the company are worth more. It's bad for you because you need to justify that higher valuation in the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. But your point is well taken, that like a higher valuation, right, is not like a just unilaterally good thing. Like, you know, it comes with, you know, you know, that valuation right now is related to expectations in the future. And the higher the expectations in the future, presumably the more you're, you know, like that gives you more pressure for sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. But okay, so that, folks, okay, all we've done is taken a product of those two numbers. So that's pretty straightforward. But what this tells us is if that multiple, if we think we'll have a 13.9 EV to revenue multiple in 6 years, given our forecast, we think our company is going to be worth $10 billion in 6 years. That's pretty valuable. Now, how do we get our value today? Well, to get our value today, we do the NPV of the cash flows from time 0 to time 6, which is what I've done here, right? Discount rate of 10%, these cash flows in the NPV function, plus manually adding the time 0 cash flow on the side. And then I'm adding 6 years discounted the terminal value at time 6, right? This is just a standard NPV of a few period of cash flows plus the present value of the terminal value. Folks okay with that? Right? So under that assumption, we now have valuation 1. Valuation 1 says that our company is worth $5 billion right now. By the way, $5 billion means that our current multiple, so our EV today, divided by our revenue today, it's not 13.9, it's 100, right? So our model is explaining why the multiple of our company right now would be so much higher than what we expect it to be in the more long term. Folks okay with this? There's a couple of other things that we can answer. We can also answer the question, what would be our multiple at time 10? Yeah, so time 10. How would we do that? Well, we can, oh, this is, okay, so this is perfectly fine. So I better just take a look at some of these things. Okay, so just plug in a random number in here at first, okay? So let's say we plug in a guess, let's say 10. Well, if we had a multiple at time 10 of 10, what would be our terminal value at time 10? Our terminal value at time 10 would be our revenue at time 10 times that multiple. So 1.8 billion, multiply that by 10, it would be 18 billion. And then given this terminal value at time 10, we can do the same NPV analysis that we did here, but instead of using cash flows for 6 periods and then terminal value at 6, we would do cash flows for 10 period and terminal value at 10. Do we agree with that? So that's what I do here, right? NPV of the cash flows from time 0 to time 10, plus the terminal value at time 10 discounted for 10 periods. And that gives me a different valuation of the company. To find out the multiple that I expect in 10 years, I need to pick this number so that this valuation and this valuation give me the same answer, so that they're consistent with each other. Does that make sense? So all I did is I used solver. I said, solver, change this number to make this number minus this number equal to 0. But that's all I did. And that gave me 8.79. So in valuation 1, where we assume our multiple at time 10, at time 6 is 13.9, and we assume all our forecasts, we are implying that our multiple is going to be 8.79 in 10 years. So notice, our multiple is 99 right now. It goes down to 13.9 in 6 years, and it goes further down to 8.79 in 10 years. We can also calculate in this model what the implied multiple is at time 3, which is when the company IPOs. By the way, when we look at a multiple at the date of an IPO, investors in private markets like VCs, they call the IPO an exit event. So we often refer to this as the exit multiple. So what would be the exit multiple in this example? Well, we can calculate our NPV, like our expected value of the company in year 3, which is the NPV of the cash flow at time 4, 5, 6, plus terminal value at time 3. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry. I screwed up the number here. It was my bad. Oh, no. I did not screw it up. I'm just getting maybe a little bit of time. I guess for a while. No, this is correct, right? This is, cash flows at time 4, 5, and 6, then terminal value at time 6, but discounted for 3 periods now because at time 3, there's 3 periods left until time 6. So given our model, we expect the company to be worth $7.3 billion at the IPO. And since the company's revenue at the IPO is 274 million, right? We just divide I don't remember what the number was, 7.3 billion divided by 270 something million. That gives us 26. So notice in our model, there's actually a bunch. What have we answered in this model? Given the assumptions we've made, we have answered what are the cash flows going to look like over time? What are the revenues going to look like over time? What are the operating income going to look like over time? What is the value today? What is the multiple today? What is the multiple and the value at the IPO? What is the multiple in 3 years? We just assumed it. But also, what is the more long-term multiple in 10 years? Right? We answered all these questions in self-consistent ways. And notice our model has generated something that we know is true for high growth companies, which is what? We expect their multiples to fall over time. Because more growth, generally a higher multiple. Folks okay with this so far? So this is our first valuation. The key thing in this valuation that's very important for the final answer that we got was that we are assuming that in 6 years, our company is going to be similar to the average company in the emerging cloud index today. Okay, that's a very important assumption. Now, this is what I call future comparables. You try to find companies right now that are comparable to you in the future. Right? And for a company that's high growth but likely to experience diminishing growth, it's really important to think about that match between a specific point in the future and some companies right now. If a company is never going to change, it doesn't matter. If they're comparable to you right now, they're comparable to you in the future because you're not changing. But for high growth companies, we know that they're changing. They're becoming less and less high growth over time, generally. Right? So thinking about what companies right now are applicable to you at a specific date in the future, it's one of these things that sounds a lot simpler than it actually is. And it has a big impact on value. Why am I, just to highlight this, let's look at our second valuation in this extension one. Because, so I did this, I tried to be pretty representative of a SaaS company, but when I did this, this number, I'm actually trying to relate this to the real world because I picked my model in such a way that it gives realistic predictions about cash flows for a typical SaaS company. Now, if you look at a typical SaaS company, even if it's a high-flying private company, a company that currently has 50 million in revenue is not able to raise money in the private market at a valuation of 5 billion. Like, that just doesn't happen. This number is way, if I compare it to the real world, it's too high. It's too high, so I don't believe this, right? So we just did it. We know the assumptions we're making, but I don't find this number believable. And so when I don't find something believable, the first thing I say to myself is, I made a wrong assumption somewhere. Let me change some assumptions, see if it gives a more plausible answer, and and how comfortable I feel about that assumption. So I'm just going to make one change to my assumption in my second valuation. Okay? The change is, instead of assuming that I apply the 13.9 multiple in 6 years for my company, I'm instead going to apply it in 3 years. So I'm going to take that 13.9 as an exit multiple instead of a times 6 multiple. Now, how do we want to think about that? This is kind of like saying, oh, look, my company, high-flying private enterprise, whatever, cloud SaaS company, I think when it exits, it's going to look like your typical emerging cloud index company right now. Right? So I think the comparable is as of the IPO date, not as of the 3-4 years after the IPO date. And so that's what I'm going to do now. So now what I'm going to do, I get my terminal value now at time 3 instead of time 6 because my 13.9 multiple is as of date 3, not date 6. So this is just 13.9 times my forecasted revenue at time 3. And then to get my value today, I take NPV of cash flows at time 0, 1, 2, and 3, and then add the terminal value at time 3, discounted for 3 periods. And that gives me 2.5 billion. The value went down. Why? Because in my valuation 1, I was assuming a multiple at exit of 26. And now I've decided instead to assume a multiple at exit of 13.9. I actually view valuation 2 to be more reasonable because actually if you go look at historical data, on the multiples of SaaS companies when they exit, almost none of them have a 26. Depending on the time, 13 is semi-sensible. That's ebbed and flowed over time. But 26 is like the outliers. And we're viewing our company as a typical SaaS company. So assuming this would be maybe too optimistic. And that's why, right? We basically have the multiple. It used to be 26. Now we use 13.9. So the value is going to roughly have. It doesn't exactly have, but close to that. Folks okay with that? And then given this, we can now recalculate the current multiple. The current multiple is roughly halved as well. So now we're applying a multiple right now for a company of 49. And we can again go through this exercise of calculating future multiples, right? So I can calculate, given a valuation today of 2.5 billion, what does that imply about my multiple in 6 years? Well, it implies a multiple in 6 years of 7.8. And it applies a multiple in 10 years of 5.1. You guys can look to see if you understand how these numbers were obtained. If you don't hesitate to ask me. But just in the interest of time, I'll just kind of tell you those numbers. By the way, this actually looks pretty realistic in terms of the real world. What this is saying is multiples right now, while you're a high-flying public company, super hot, something like a 50. When you go public, right, you exit at a multiple that looks like the emerging cloud index, 13.9. But once you go public, your growth starts to gradually fall. Because your growth starts to gradually fall, your multiple gradually falls more. Goes down from 13.9 to 7.8 after 3 years. And then another 4 years later, it goes down to 5.1. Now 5.1 is interesting because let's think about what this means, right? So remember, this is an EV to revenue, right? So value to revenue ratio. We've got margins of roughly 25%. So in the long term, loosely, I would expect my EBITDA to be 25% of my revenue, loosely, right? Well, if that's the case, I would expect value to EBITDA ratio to be 4 times this number, 20. That should be close to being a PE ratio. Well, a 20 PE ratio is actually a pretty sensible ratio. Of course, like P's right now are higher than that, right? But like, I don't expect the P ratios to be as high as they are right now in 10 years. I just don't expect that. You look at the more long-term averages over the last decade or so, I think 20 has been actually a reasonable number that we've seen. So this is actually giving us numbers that actually seem like they bear some relationship to the real world. By the way, I often ask myself these types of questions when I'm trying to decide whether I believe a valuation that I do, right? I try to see like, okay, what are the additional numbers that I can calculate? Given those numbers, what would I expect to see on numbers that I know I can easily look up online, Bloomberg or Google Finance or stuff like that? Oh, P ratios. It's very easy to go find, like, how is the PE ratio of the S&P 500 changed over time? Like, those are numbers that we can go dig up. So I try to kind of anchor my model to what does it say about this company in relationship to the S&P 500 in the more long term? Because in the more long term, I expect this company to kind of stabilize, right? So to me, I try to, like, I think that's useful, right? You build a model and you further explore your model to see if it makes credible statements about the future, right? On important things like, what's your long-term multiple? What's your stuff like that? Okay, so hopefully that's something that's
Jiro?
useful to think of. Yes?
I just had a question. At a certain point, does it make sense to go from having an EV to revenue multiple or like ratio to then going to an EV to EBITDA because of the fact that your operating income is going to be positive?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Like, I've never done it before, right? But like, I see no reason why you wouldn't. Like, so what Katrina, right?
Yeah.
What Katerina is saying is, look, I justified using EV to revenue because the company loses money right now. But, you know, if this company loses money right now, but I want to get a terminal value at time 10 and I expect the company to be making money at time 10, might it be better for me to calculate my terminal multiple at time 10 on EBITDA and use my EBITDA forecast instead of, you know, using revenue 10 years from now just because the company right now is losing money? So, you know what? I find that to be completely sensible. So absolutely, that's something that you could do. And what I would say is, I would actually, I mean, it makes sense to do both, right? And, you know, you feel a bit more comfortable in your valuation if the two numbers are relatively close. And if the two numbers are miles apart, you know, you probably don't want to bet the house on your valuation. So this goes to a more general statement, and it applies not just recurring revenue businesses, but any valuation model you bring. Ask yourself, how many different ways could I semi-sensibly do this valuation? Let me do all of them, and let me see if they are roughly similar or not. The more similar they are, the more comfortable you're with your valuation. The less similar there are, maybe you want to average the valuation. It's when people do people oftentimes refer in a valuation pitch of like a football field of valuations. I mean, that's basically that. Like, I'm going to value this in a bunch of, you know, semi-sensible ways and get a holistic sense of this portfolio valuations. So absolutely, what you mentioned is a totally sensible thing to do. So,
would you, like, at a certain point, would you go from saying, okay, we have an EV of revenue at year 7 at this, and then maybe at year 10 you say, okay, doesn't make sense to look at EV over revenue, let's look at EV over EBITDA?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I would rephrase it is,
yeah,
you know, like let's make it like a formulaic rule, right? Mm-hmm. For a company that right now is losing money, right? Do all the EV to revenue valuations. For valuations at times when they also, like where you have a terminal value that is occurring on a date where you're now profitable, in addition to the revenue one, do the EBITDA one.
Okay.
So when you can do both, do both. I think that would be a pretty safe and steady. And again, I would just say, like, do every valuation that is really that's actually sensible.
Hey, Jiro.
For just a general statement, for every one valuation that you see in a, you know, financial practitioner pitch, trust me, there was a hell of a lot larger number of valuations done in the background, including different styles of valuation like that as well. So for yourself, do all of them, and then you think about how you curate your valuation for presentation purposes to make things more manageable. Yeah, someone had a question?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I do. So you give us 2 valuation, right? Which one you would trust more? Like?
Yeah. So for me, without a doubt, this is not even a close call. This valuation 2, I believe more.
So,
and
like,
the reason.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, in this specific case, now the reason why that's the case is because, again, empirically, exit multiples of 26 for an IPO. Look at every single IPO that has ever occurred for a SaaS, like an enterprise SaaS company. I actually believe there has never been one that's exited at 26. If there is, it's like 1 or 2, right? So that kind of makes me think, wow, this is probably optimistic. So this is something that, like, makes me say, I'm not sure I believe valuation 1. Meanwhile, like 13.9 is like, you know, in the current market environment is sensible for exit multiple at IPO. Because if you look at the history of exit multiples for SaaS companies, like 13.9 is a bit high. okay? But there have been periods in like the hot periods for SaaS where, you know, you've had like above 10, 10 to 12, let's say, as an average. And we expect the multiple to be a little bit higher right now because the interest, like discount rates are low right now, we know. And we also expect discount rates to stay low for a while because just from the risk-free rate case, right? Because if we look at the yield curve on riskless bonds, the yield curve right now is like low for an extended period of time. Right? So when discount rates are lower, we expect a higher multiple, right? Two important drivers of multiples are growth and discount rate. I believe actually that's something that Vadim explicitly discussed with you guys, right?
But here you assume like the company go public at year 3, right?
Yep.
What if they actually does IPO in year 6? Then the
Yeah. I mean, okay, well, maybe I should, I did kind of carefully make a bunch of these decisions. The reason why I'm assuming IPO happens in 3 years is those numbers I got, like, oh, you know, about a $50 million loss right now. Oh, you know, revenue growth of 75% over the next 3 years. Remember where I got that data from? I got it by looking at companies that IPO'd, and it was their reported numbers for the 3 years before that. So that's why I'm assuming IPO in 3 years, is because like that's where I got my data from, right? Now, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no guarantee you exit in 3 years, right? Maybe it'll be in 4, maybe it'll be in 7, maybe it'll be in 1. We don't know for sure, right? I'm just assuming like, you know, as a, you know, that this company is kind of looks like a company that's going to exit in 3 years. When I teach you guys the VC stuff, I'm going to give you guys some guidance on how we try to forecast what exit date, like when exit dates are going to occur. Okay, so that's something I will talk in the classroom. It won't be until January, so you probably won't remember that I promised this. But nonetheless, it is something we'll discuss at some point, but I want to kind of, again, that's not the goal here. The goal here is really to understand the mechanics of this spreadsheet and the different valuations. Sound good? All right. So I'm going to now start discussing extension 2. You guys have a lot of stamina, so I'm impressed. It's easier to talk for a long time than it is to listen for a long time, although I'm not sure what that says about me. But I think that's a pretty, you know, that's a statement that applies to most folks. But as I said, extension 2 now, right? Remember, we want to add a little bit more realism, right? So a little bit more realism. What's the realism that I'm going to add now? I'm going to add customer dynamics. So I'm gonna think like, okay, how often do people drop, like a customer that you have this period? How often do they stop being a customer? And when they stay, how much do they increase their marginal profits? Right? I'm also going to assume, and I added this to the example because of something that was asked in class, whenever in Zoom yesterday, by Tony. He's not here anymore, but Tony had said, hey, what if customer acquisition costs change over time? So I went and actually looked at the historical data to see if CAC does actually change over time for the BVP emerging cloud index companies. And the answer is that it does. It goes up a little bit every year. So I'm going to use some of that data to also modeling changing CAC over time too. Okay, so what am I specifically going to assume? I'm going to assume an extension 2. So I'm going to continue making the assumptions before, with the exception of a couple of changes. Some of the changes are going to be about customer dynamics. Changes of customer dynamics are going, oh shoot, okay, I forgot to change some of these numbers. Let's see. So I'm just going to extension 2 spreadsheet. There's a couple of typos in this slide because I was kind of triangulating my numbers a little bit. So first, let me explain in this extension what I assume about changing customer dynamics over time. Okay? So in particular, I'm going to assume the following. This is still as before. Each newly acquired customer generates $200K in revenue to the company during the first year, where that's paid at the end of the year. So that hasn't changed. That's like before. But notice I added the term newly. The reason is, over time, customers that stay are going to spend more and more. So in particular, I'm going to assume customers that stay increase their spending with the company by 10% per year. I'm going to assume margins of 25% in the first year, but also every subsequent year. So what that means is servicing the customer is going to cost $150,000 of 200. That's 75% of 200. And that number is going to grow by 10% per year as well, so that that margin is staying constant at 25%. So far, so good? The final thing I'm assuming, well, one other thing that I'm assuming about customer dynamics is after you acquire a customer, 5% of customers drop each year. That's our churn rate. And I'm going to assume the churn rate is constant over time. So 5% drop after 1 year. So one customer becomes 0.95 customers. After 2 years, it's 0.95 squared. After 3 years, it's 0.95 cubed or something like that. Okay, so I am making one simplifying assumption here, which is the churn rate and the increase in spend every year for customers that stay. I'm assuming those two numbers are constant over time. Okay, that's not totally realistic, but it's a good first pass for modeling these customer dynamics. The final element of customer dynamics that I'm going to model is this changing CAC. So I'm going to assume at time 0, the company, which is right now, the company pays $1 in customer acquisition cost per dollar of new next period revenue acquired. That number, 1 here, 1, is the 1.3 number that I used before, right? So actually the number is not 1.3 right now. I'm assuming it's 1, but I assume that number goes up by 5 cents every year. So that ratio is 1 today. It's going to be 105 in a year, 110 in 2 years, 115 in 3 years, so on and so forth. By the way, that was anchored to data because the year after an IPO, the number is 115 in the average BVP Cloud Emerging Index data. And 3 years later, it's 130. So I just I took, 115, 130, and then I just kind of drew a straight line between those 2 points to take a guesstimate of how that ratio changes over time. So just going up by 5 cents every year. It is a specific assumption, but I'm going to incorporate that into the valuation. Are we okay here? So let's think about how we change our model now. And by the way, I'm only going to do valuation 2 from what I did in extension 1. I'm going to skip valuation 1. You'll see even in my spreadsheet, I say skipped. If any of you guys want to try to do it and then ask me like, hey, did I do it correctly? I'm happy to check. Okay? But I'm just going to do one of the valuation illustrations. The real changes that are occurring in this extension 2 vis-a-vis extension 1 are really happening in the cash flow forecasting part of this exercise. So let's go. I'll kind of work you guys through this. By the way, there is another change that I made. In extension 1 and the simple example, I assumed you had 250. You were starting with 256 customers. Now I'm assuming 245. The reason why I did that was to kind of match up the revenue numbers at time 0. I should mention one other thing that I haven't mentioned yet, which is, remember, we need to think about how much money we're making from our past cohorts. And since customers pay more and more money over time, our past cohort is not generating 200,000 a year anymore. It generates a bit more than that because that past cohort has been with us for a while. Yes? So I'm going to assume our past cohort generates revenue at time 0 as though they've been around for 1 year. In other words, right, whatever, like the cohort we had before, it's fallen by 5%, but it's spending 10% more. In other words, its spend has gone up relative to 200 per person by 4.5%. If you're wondering where the 4.5% comes from, I should actually mention this to you guys. And with regards to customer dynamics, I'm just gonna draw your attention to these numbers here, right? So we had assumed a 5% churn rate, meaning one customer becomes 0.95 customers, right? Or 1 minus 0.05. But each of those 0.95 customers spend $1.10 instead of $1 per dollar. So if we look at how much money we make from the whole cohort, how does the money from that cohort change over time? Churn rate makes it go up. Dollar spend per stay makes it go up. Sorry, churn rate makes it go down, and dollar spend per remaining customer makes it go up. What's the net effect? The net effect is $1 in revenue from last period becomes 1 minus churn rate times 1 plus revenue growth rate per stayed customer, product of those two things. So in this case, right, 1 minus the churn rate times 1 plus the growth for kept customers, right? So 0.95 times 1.1, that gives us 1.045. What does that mean? That means, look, first period, we get 50K per customer. We expect from that customer to get 4.5% more marginal profit next period. If they stay, we get 10%, but 5% of the time they would drop. So notice this is actually reflected in my spreadsheet. By the way, this is a number that people pay close attention to for recurring revenue businesses. This number here, the term is dollar retention rate. Dollar retention rate means if you get $1, like for every dollar that you get from your cohort today, how many dollars do you expect to get next year? This means you expect to get $1.045. So this means you're expecting to get more and more money over time in this example from your cohort, even though you lose customers, because your lost customers are more than offset by the extra spend on your remaining customers. This is not about new customers coming in. This is about just what's coming from those customers. This is sometimes also referred to as dollar churn. So a churn rate usually refers to customers, what percentage of them stay or go. Dollar churn is what percentage of your dollars disappear. And when this number is bigger than 1, dollars aren't disappearing, they're appearing. So we call this a negative dollar churn. This would be a minus 4.5% dollar churn. Just in case you guys want to know some of the standard lingo. Okay, but now let's talk about how that customer dynamic shows up in our financial model, okay? So I'll highlight a couple of things. So first, so I've basically changed all of these numbers, the formulas in all of these numbers relative to our previous 2 examples. So I'll explain things one at a time. So where does this number come from? As I said, I'm assuming I have 245 customers right now. 245, that's this number here. And then the question is, how much revenue do I get right now from each of those 245 customers? From each of those 245 customers, these aren't, 245 is the number of customers I had last year. So from each of the customers I had last year, I should clarify, right? I get 200 times that dollar retention rate, because now I expect from those customers to have 4.5% more of that. So that's where this number came from. It's 245, the customers I had last year. Last year, they were all spending 200, but this year they all spend 209, which is the 200 times 1.045. So that's how much they spend now. How much are they going to spend a year later? It's going to be that number grown by 4.5%. B33 was that dollar retention. No, B11 was dollar retention rate. So it's going to grow by 4.5%, grows by 4.5%, 4.5%, 4.5%, yada, yada, yada. So that's all. So notice adding that customer dynamic associated with dollar retention rate is easy. This is just given my assumption, since the churn and the growth in spend for customers that stay, since I assume those things were constant, right? This is just basically like a growing perpetuity with a constant growth rate. Now, we could model it differently, where the churn would change over time, then the growth rate wouldn't be constant over time anymore. But in this setting, I assumed it was constant. But notice we're just keeping track of how much the spending in the cohort is changing over time. Okay, so that's the first change. I'm going to be reflecting similar changes in all the positive parts of the other cohort columns, right? The only thing is I'm not going to need to do 200 times 1.045. So like this is just, number of new customers that I get at time 0 times 200. I think B8 was the 200. Everywhere that I said 200, I actually didn't mean 200, because I was supposed to put profit per, not revenue per, right? So apologies for that. So notice I'm highlighting the 50, right? Because I get a marginal profit of 50 per customer. I have 183 customers. That's where this number comes from. Same thing here. This number here was revenue per times the margin. That's what I've done here. Sorry, I actually misspoke for the first entry in this column. Maybe I'll just restate it again, just because I didn't say it correctly the first time, right? 245, the number of customers I had last year, right? And on average for each customer I had last year, I expect to be earning in revenue 209, which was this grown by 1 year. But in terms of profit, since my margin is 25%, I take 25% of that. That gives me my marginal profit. But thereafter, everything just grows at 4.5%. Same thing here. I get a profit of 50 per times the number of customers in that cohort. And then I grow that also at the 4.5% per year. So this grown by 4.5%, grown by 4.5%, so on and so forth. Same thing. 312 customers, profit of 50 per. Just pop this up. Of 50 per. That's where I got that number. And then I'm just growing that 4.5% per year as well. Okay. This grown by 4.5%. But I mean, this is just kind of staying, I'm just basically saying the same thing over and over again there. Are we okay so far? Now, the other thing that's changed in the spreadsheet is my customer acquisition cost. Because before, my customer acquisition cost was, always with that ratio CAC to revenue, to new revenue of 1.3. But now, I'm assuming that it's $1 today and it goes up by 5 cents every year. So I've created an extra column that keeps track of CAC divided by revenue per. And how do I get my CAC for each cohort? Well, the time, if I look at the time 0 cohort, I have 183 members in that cohort. They will each generate 200 in revenue per 200. And my CAC for each of those 200 is $1. Right? So notice the CAC for each customer acquired at time 1 is no longer 260,000. It's 200,000, right? 200 times 1. And so 200,000 times this number of new customers is this 37 million roughly. What about this one? Exact same formula. 312 customers times the 200,000 in revenue, but times the new CAC to ARPR ratio, which has gone up a little bit because it's becoming harder and harder to acquire new customers because I try to acquire the easy customers first. You guys see like the pattern that's developing here, right? So same thing here, same formula, except I use the 1.1 instead of the 1.05. Same formula, but with the 1.15, so on and so forth. And one implication of this model is what's happening to my unit economics over time. Is my unit economics getting better or worse? Right, the efficiency of customer acquisition is getting worse because this ratio is going up, meaning it's getting more and more expensive for me to acquire users. Since it's more and more expensive, getting new customers is becoming less and less valuable. But once I've made this change, so I've done this change literally for every single one of the cohorts. So all the changes I'm making in this spreadsheet from extension 1 to extension 2, all the changes are happening here. Once I've done that, the parts that we had focused on in extension 1, which was get all the CapEx stuff, get your cash flows, and populate your valuations, everything else is perfectly fine. We don't need to touch that, right? So when we added customer dynamics in our template, it just required us to change stuff here. Not, the CapEx, the depreciation, because I'm assuming all that stuff, those forecast ratios that I used to get this haven't changed. Now, when I say that hasn't changed, I don't mean that the numbers here are the same as what they were before. What I mean is the formulas that generate the number here for our template have remained unchanged. So that when we change all the numbers here, it automatically changes these numbers the right way. Are we okay with this? I mean, that's the essence of a good template, right? Is, when you change things in one place, a good template has a bunch of parts where you don't need to go and change those, they change automatically. Again, I mean, I can imagine first time you're seeing this, probably the details are a bit overwhelming. And I really do think the best way to get comfortable with this stuff is to actually review the spreadsheet a bit yourself until you hit a stumbling block and then come to me. One of these things to get you guys to all fully internalize every detail of the spreadsheet right now, it would be impossible. You can only do that on a one-to-one. So the most efficient way is you guys put in a bit of effort in it, and then if there's parts that are difficult, you come to me. It's an open invitation on that front, because I really do want folks to be comfortable with these templates. And actually, in a perfect world, I would like you guys to be comfortable with, hey, I'm comfortable with this template, and I have some views on how I would change assumptions. And if I put enough work, I would feel comfortable changing the template to reflect my new assumptions, right? That's the perfect thing, because it gives you a skill set that is as flexible as possible. And if you are really mindful about your assumptions, it also allows you to revisit your assumptions over time so that you can potentially improve your templates. Again, I know I sound like a broken record when saying this stuff, but it's because I actually think it's extremely important. I've done a couple of extra things in the extension 2 template, which is for valuation purposes, I don't need to do anything beyond this and the stuff that was common with my, my extension 1 template, which was this stuff, right? So I don't need to do anything more than that. I'm going to do something more just because it generates additional useful insights while also serving as practice to the concept of unit economics, okay? Which is everything that I've done here. So what have I done here? So TV10 superscript C, that means the terminal value at time 10 of my cohort. So C means cohort. Given the assumptions I've made, which effectively are beyond time 10, your cohort operating income numbers, they're going up by 4.5% per year. Do we agree? Right? Because we're assuming churn rate never changes, growth in spend per customer doesn't change, margin doesn't change. So given all those assumptions, right, these are the operating income from cohort C, which in this case is the past cohort, right? Those numbers are going to increase by 4.5% per year. And so if we want to get the terminal value at time 10, what do we need to do? We just say, take the profit number from time 10, grow it by 4.5% to get the profit for the next period. So grown by 4.5%. And then divide it by R minus G, right? Because it's just a growing perpetuity and given my assumptions. So R, B18, minus G, what is the G? It's 4.5%, which is 1.045 minus 1. So, right, which is just minus 1 plus R, sorry, minus 1 plus G, sorry, minus 1 minus G plus 1 is just minus G. So if you're just kind of wondering why in the world is there this plus 1, it was just, I only put it there to offset the fact that I entered this in here as 1.045 instead of 0.045. That's the only reason. This is just a growing perpetuity formula. Okay, so that gives me terminal value of each cohort. If I want to get the NPV of each cohort, all I have to do is NPV of the marginal profits for each cohort from time 1 to time 10, plus manually entering in the time 0 number, plus discounting this terminal value at the discount rate for 10 years. Is that okay? All I did is, this is telling me, what is the value of this cohort today? I do the same thing. What is the value of this cohort today? Right, so my problem, you know, my past cohort is worth 256 million today. The cohort I'm about to acquire right now is worth 130 million. The one that I'm expecting to acquire in a year is today, not in a year, but today, worth 198 million, so on and so forth. These are a bunch of numbers. But the more, I mean, this is just to kind of highlight, hey, just have that discipline of thinking about cohorts as sequences of cash flows that you can do NPV on. And now the last things I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the customer level, the NPV of a customer acquired at time C, but as of the date of acquisition. So not as of time 0, but as of when we acquire them. All right, so notice, what am I doing here? What did I do here? B8. Sorry, I'm just trying to remember what I did here. B8 was the 50. B8 is the 50. I'm just using a perpetuity formula for this, right? When we acquire the customer, we know he or she is going to generate 50 in a year, right? And that 50 is going to grow by 4.5% every year, and we've got a discount rate of 10%. So what is the value of the future benefits of the company? It's just a growing perpetuity formula. And then to get the NPV of the customer, I subtract the CAC that I need to pay for a customer, which is what? The CAC divided by RPR times that first revenue that I get. So 1 times 200,000. So that means an individual customer received at time 0 is worth a lot of money, 709,000 at time 0. Next year, the customers I get are going to be worth a little bit less because I have to pay more to get them. So the customers I expect to get in a year, they'll be worth 699,000 per, like in a year, not right now. Then 689,000, so on and so forth. So this is literally doing remember what I had done here in my simple example? What I'm doing in those individual cells that we're discussing right now is literally calculating this number for each cohort because we know those numbers are changing cohort to cohort. And the reason why in this example the numbers are so much higher is because in this case, the cohorts are spending more and more money every year. Let's continue looking at this. We can also calculate an LTV to CAC ratio. What's the LTV to CAC ratio? It's the NPV of this stuff divided by the CAC. So that's all I calculated here. This is just computing. It's basically, look, you know, if you look at it quickly, it doesn't look coherent, but it's just simple NPV calculations, right? It's the NPV of the future stuff, so NPV of all this stuff, divided by this number, and I take a minus to make this a positive ratio. So what this is saying is if we treat this as a perpetuity, right, the LTV to CAC ratio is 4.5 right now, which is above 3, which is a typical ratio that VCs look for an enterprise SaaS company. But this number is progressively going down. Right, so this is additional stuff that my template is doing, is it's just automatically calculating unit economics across our different cohorts. And again, this was something that we had talked about earlier, right? We said, look, you know, we expect the unit economics or like the effectiveness of acquiring customers to change over time. So we might want to monitor it. And we might care about like, when does this number like fall below 1? Because the moment the number falls below 1, growth is bad, right? Because if LTV to CAC is less than 1, that means the NPV of a customer is negative. So that customers are bad. You paying for new customers is a bad thing instead of a good thing. Now here, that's not happening. By the way, you know, our template also kind of can calculate things under different assumptions, right? So for instance, what if we wanted to go back to the assumption we made before about 0 churn and 0 growth per kept customer? Let's see what happens to those unit economics, because in this example, the unit economics would be getting worse because our CAC is going up every year, right? From you know, CAC to ARPR of 1 to 1.05, so on and so forth. So I'm just changing these things to 0 just to illustrate, right? Because it's a template. We can change these numbers. Everything else gets calculated correctly. And indeed, right, we can see this is staying constant because there's, you know, no growth and no churn. So notice in this example, our LTV to CAC ratio is initially 2.5, but it gradually goes down. And by the time we get to time 10, it's down to 1.7, right? So it's fallen. The unit economics have gotten worse. By the way, you might say to yourself, wait a second, you changed the churn and the growth per stayed customer to 0. Why isn't this number equal to the number we had before? Because the number we had before was 1.9. Why is this number higher, i.e. 2.5? Well, remember, when we calculated 1.9, we assumed that the ratio CAC to ARPR was 1.3 right now. Notice in our new spreadsheet, currently it's 1. If I change this to 1.3, 3 would make it 1.6 here. So it's a bit convoluted, but the way to get it to be like that is to make this 1.6 here. So 1.6, let's take a look at our table. If it's 1.6, it's currently at 1.3, right? And then it's going up. Well, now we're going to have the unit economics we used to have, 1.92, right? 1.92. Let's look at our original number, 1.92. And if we want to get to exactly what we used to have, the way I laid out my spreadsheet is not going to achieve it. It's because my template here, I anchor, no, I could do 1.3 and 0. 1.3 and 0. We look at the unit economics. It's constant, just like it was before. And let's look at our value. Value is slightly different, so I'll have to think about why that's the case. Okay. Now, everything is the same. The only thing is the valuations are a little bit different because remember here I assume 256 customers. Actually, well, I'm going to reconcile it. The way I'm going to reconcile it. This is what happens when you change things without having ever thought of it before, is you have to kind of start to calibrate. I'm just going to make this 256 now. Should give me exactly this, like identical to what I got in extension 1. Let's look at the valuation. 2.5 billion. Right? So notice this extension 2, it nests extension 1. So it's like a more general version of extension 1, which allows for some change in customer dynamics. Sound good? So I'm just going to go and re-put the numbers as I stated them in the statement of the problem. And then this was 1.6. No, it was 1.3. 1.3 and 0.05. Yeah, correct. Okay, so now I'm back to the. These are the right numbers. It's just like I like to refer to the data from the original spreadsheet, so I realize that I may have changed the data reference settings, but that's okay. Folks have any question? By the way, I'm impressed that you guys exhibited so much stamina.
I actually just have a question.
Sure.
It's related to like yesterday's class, but I just really don't understand how Wayfair's business model could be considered a recurring revenue.
Yeah, so I think the reason why you're saying this is because as opposed to Amazon, people buy furniture much less often.
Yeah, like in my head, it's like
Yeah.
he has like a one-time sale. Like you go, you buy your dresser, you buy your table, and then you
Yeah.
go.
I think like I would. So what I will say is I definitely agree with the statement that it's kind of less of a sticky recurring revenue than Amazon, because Amazon, like, constant need, well, not need, but like constant habit of buying stuff on Amazon. Meanwhile, you're right, like with Wayfair, it's like I only buy a bed once. But the thing is, like, although this doesn't technically apply to me, but like, I think like what you see with users of Wayfair is, on one day they'll buy, some like garden furniture from Wayfair, and the next time they want to buy a dresser, they'll go look at Wayfair.
Okay.
Right. Now, but you're right. It's kind of like less sticky, and I would probably assume like, maybe if you wanted to model Wayfair perfectly, you'd want to think about like, well, once you've bought everything, you're not going to be buying anything for a while, so you might want to think of modeling that. Because I 100% agree, and actually, it's pretty nice that you thought about this. That like we shouldn't just blindly think of everything as like a one type of recurring revenue. We might want to think about. Here's another example, right? So, have you heard of a public company called Stitch Fix? So, Stitch Fix is like subscription packages for clothes.
Oh, okay, yeah. It's like
Right.
Frank does that too now.
The what? Frank and Oak? Yeah, that's right. So Frank and Oak would be amazing, right? So like, let's think about like Stitch Fix or Frank and Oak, right? Their model is like, we'll send you a package, and if you don't want it, send it back.
Mhm.
And they care about like the packages they send that do not get sent back, right? And they would like the do not send back to happen more often as opposed to less often. Now, early on, once I sign up to Frank and Oak or Stitch Fix, like probably early on, I'm more likely to keep the packages because I'm like, you know, generating my portfolio of clothing. Probably the only person who calls it portfolio of clothing. Well, actually, you guys will probably call it that after a proper finance degree, right? But like, once I've accepted 20 packages, all of a sudden I'm like, I'm not really in the market for this stuff anymore. So I'm probably going to send back more often, or like, you know, click the box saying don't send it to me every month, right? So there's some recurring revenue businesses where we like expect the recurrence to last longer than others. And this is one example, right? So something like Amazon, I expect recurrence to happen longer than with Stitch Fix. And with Stitch Fix, I expect it to last longer than with Wayfair, like just intuitively. By the way, I mean, it's good that Noah stayed on here as well, because you had asked the question about disruption risk. Well, in some sense, this is like its own kind of disruption risk, right? When do I stop accepting new packages, right? That is like a disruption as well. It's not a disruption because a new competitor comes in, just because I'm consumption saturated, right? So we might want to actually model, might want to think about modeling Wayfair or modeling Frank and Oak as something like, you know, you get recurring cash flows, but you think it's going to end after a certain time once you've acquired all your furniture or once you've acquired your wardrobe, right? And so that might be something you want to think about, because if you naively assume people will accept forever, it starts to make no sense, right? Like, why in the world would you want, I mean, I don't know, it never made sense to me to have 100 different, you know, sets of clothing or something. Or to have,
it makes you wonder if you're ever going to be able to accurately predict, like if you're ever going to be able to accurately model these businesses, because I feel like there's so many different types as is, and the business models seem to be changing so fast in this day and age. Like I don't know.
Yeah, but like, so absolutely right. I mean, like, look, let's not, like, we shouldn't kid ourselves and actually think that this is perfect. And you're absolutely right. It'll never be perfect. But let's also take a step back and say, like, well, even for traditional businesses, this was a highly imperfect exercise, and there's always room for improvement. So absolutely, like, the goal is never like we'll get it perfect, but we do want to try to opportunistically make use of anything that we can use to improve the model, right? And I think, like, you know, I think here's what I'll say. It's like, for these types of valuations, so financial modeling for recurring revenue business, we're still a bit in a Wild West era. Like, we don't have a lot of like detailed guidance. Why? Precisely because it hasn't been around long enough for us to really know. And I do actually believe right now, when people value these companies, they take a little bit too much of a one-size-fits-all approach. And exactly as both of you guys have pointed out, like, it isn't really one-size-fits-all. Like, a Wayfair is different from an Amazon. It's not just all e-commerce. And we should think a little bit more carefully about that stuff. And what that highlights is, pay attention to that when you're paying attention to the world, right? And try to think like, okay, you know, for different types of e-commerce, how long should I expect that recurrence to last? For an Amazon, I expect it to last, you know, for 20 years. But for a Wayfair, I expect it to last for 3 years. And for Frank and Oak, I expect it to last for 2 years, but on a monthly basis instead of an annual basis. You know, things like that. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, are these the types of things you're researching right now? Is this what you're looking to gain greater insights on?
Yeah. So this type, going into the weeds of really trying to model this stuff accurately, and to try to get like things as right and detailed as possible. Look, the reality is, in terms of like nerdy academic professor research, like that's not the kind of stuff that you publish in academic journals.
Okay.
Academic journals, like what we tend to focus on more and get more excited about, is abstracting away from a lot of detail and picking up some really more big picture pattern.
Okay.
So like going into the weeds like that is something that is of value and important in practice, but tends to be less the focus and domain of academia per se, which might be one of the reasons why this doesn't get taught that much in the classroom. So for academic research, this is not stuff that I do. But I do some consulting with VCs, where I help them with doing these types of valuation of SaaS companies and assessing unit economics. And so for some of the consulting work that I've done, I've had to think about this more carefully, but I'll still openly admit, like, I produce a model that's better than things that they've thought about before, but there's still a lot of things where I'm kind of, making a bunch of assumptions that I can't perfectly validate. So, as of this date, I think, I still feel like I do a good job. And I feel like I add value to the people who ask for my help. But one of the reasons I add value is maybe the bar is relatively low. Right. The fact that sorry?
No, sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, my point is, like, a lot of even like, high profile VCs or high profile investors in emerging public SaaS companies, like, you'd be surprised how unsophisticated their model is. Right. And what that means is there's room to innovate. Right. And if that's like, when you spot an area where there's room to innovate for your career, you should get excited, because that means if you innovate there, you get some, you should, if the labor market works well, you should get some benefit from having done that. Right. So I view this as an opportunity for you guys, right? Like, I can teach you guys a little bit, but even as I talk about it, I tell you guys, I'm making this assumption. I'm not sure if it's true. It's in blue, it's not in red, or I haven't, there's a bunch of things where I just don't have the data to say, but one could imagine that it matters quite a bit for the valuation. And you should like, there's two ways to react to this. One is to say, like, oh shit, Jiro's wasting my time because, clearly he doesn't have a great model. Or you can say, oh wow, like, this is an opportunity that if I like actually, get a better sense than what's been presented here or what gets used in practice, I can have like much more, like, I can have materially more informative valuations than others, right? One is to say,
yeah, sorry. No, sorry.
a more general statement that applies quite broadly is, when you do something like this, it's important to know what you know and to know what you don't know. And for what you don't know, to keep in mind how you could improve and start to know. So, and that's why it's really useful to know, like, in detail, what assumptions are you making in a template, and to critically question those assumptions.
Right. Interesting. Honestly, I find this stuff fascinating. I'm just wondering, so what would you say the reason is that, like, that practitioners' models are so imprecise? Would you say it's a matter of time constraints, or would you say it's just like they haven't really, like, put the thought into how these elements are gonna impact their models?
I would say, I mean, you'll see both. But I think I think it's probably more the second, and the second is kind of compounded by the fact that, like, this kind of stuff doesn't get taught in the classroom.
Right.
Like, I mean, I'm actually pretty sure I haven't done it recently, but, like, if you type, like, if you go to Harvard Business School's, like, Harvard Business School Press and search for case studies, And if you try to find a financial model and valuation of a recurring revenue business, at least as of a couple of years ago, there were none. There were no cases written on this, right? Again, this is partially a function of the fact that, nerdy professors like me seldom, like the only reason I started thinking about these types of companies was because I was asked to develop a VC course at McGill. And I was like, oh man, like there's a lot of stuff I don't know about VC. It doesn't strike me as I should just relabel things from standard corporate finance. And so I went and talked to a bunch of my friends and ex-contacts that worked in the technology, and I just basically built things from scratch off of what I learned from them. So I took some of what they said and I tried to build on it and tried to make it a little bit more logically rigorous. Like I had to build on that stuff from scratch. And it's not to say that all of this stuff is new. Cohort analysis gets done. It just doesn't maybe necessarily always get or often get implemented as rigorously and comprehensively as what I've shown you, right? But the only reason this gets, taught by me, for instance, is because I had to develop it for teaching and I ended up doing a little bit of it as consulting. Okay. So it's kind of like an accident of history. And without that accident of history, I'd be a nerdy, I'm not saying this disparagingly, because I am, I'd be kind of a bit clueless about it because, I'm doing my research on things that abstract away from a lot of these things. And this trend is relatively new. It's 10 years old. So it's not really historically been on an academic's radar. And so it doesn't get taught in the classroom. And, if something doesn't get taught in the classroom, right, most practitioners won't end up using it because most practitioners use what they've been taught. They improve on the way they use it, but they don't reinvent the entire building block of the model. Some people do, but they're like rare.
Okay.
Now, with that said, I don't want to, there is another justifiable reason for why practitioners wouldn't spend the time to build this model, which is they might also, in terms of giving benefit of the doubt, they might be like, well, look, we could build a better model, but there's so many inputs that we just don't know right now that it's maybe we're kind of missing the point by over detailing something where all the inputs we don't even know, right? So we might have this great formula, but with junk in, we get junk out. Right. And so maybe they're like, look, we won't build this model until we have more comprehensive data. So some people might actually take that perspective.
Okay, interesting.
But those people, what I would say is they would probably, if a practitioner of that type that says, yes, we could build a better model, but we don't have the data yet to build it. I think those people would say we should pay attention to see if that data comes in the future. And once it's there, then we'll build it.
Right.
So that's my perspective on that.
Interesting, because if you look at, for example, newspapers and magazines, all of those would be recurring revenue in the sense, if you got a subscription or cell phones as well. So in those cases, what were the models that were being used? Just a standard model?
Traditionally recurring revenue businesses have been analyzed like normal businesses. But the thing is, traditionally recurring revenue businesses haven't been as high growth as SaaS companies or e-commerce. And those real funky patterns that you see, you're losing money a lot right now and it's getting bigger and bigger losses, right? And that's good news, right? That weird stuff that requires this type of modeling, it's most important for the high growth ones, right? So the traditional recurring revenue stuff had a more measured growth rate. It's just a reality, recurring, maybe I would almost say this model is most important to do for recurring revenue meets technology in a world where you can enter and expand in a market, which is huge because it's a global market, really fast. And that's where you see these really funky patterns happen. If you're a super slow growth recurring revenue business, if you look at the cash flow patterns, it's going to look a lot more like the Microsoft. Well, it's going to look like the Microsoft, but growing more slowly. And, so I think that's the way that I would think about
I just ask one more question about the model? I just want to be sure I understood
Sure.
something properly. So you calculate the dollar retention rate. The dollar retention rate, first of all, I just want to be sure also I got that formula right.
Of course.
You take 1 minus the churn,
churn
rate,
rate.
and multiply it by 1
Plus
minus
the growth.
Yes,
No, 1
okay.
plus the growth in
Plus.
spend per kept customer.
Right. I thought I heard minus originally, but I was like, that doesn't make.
Honestly, I may have said minus.
No, I
I'm
don't
sure I
think
missed.
so.
Yeah.
Damn.
But definitely, you look at the formula right here. 1
But-
minus churn rate times 1 plus it. And the interpretation of dollar retention rate is if at time t the cohort generated marginal profits of $1, it's going to generate 1 plus the dollar retention rate next period. So when this
Yeah, sorry.
So when this number is bigger than 1,
Mhm.
that means the cohort is generating more money for you over time. When the number is less than 1, it means kind of like the cohort is vanishing,
Right.
right? And like technology investors, VCs included in this, are most excited when this number is bigger than 1. So if you do an online search for negative dollar churn in Google, find some hits on that. Whenever they talk about the company that has a negative dollar churn, they'll be talking positively about that.
Okay.
Because look, let's put it this way. If you've got a recurring revenue business, but your product is shitty, you will have a dollar retention rate that is less than 1 guaranteed.
Because you're going to be losing people.
Because you're going to be losing people because they're not happy. And the ones that stay are probably staying more out of inertia. So they're not going to spend more money.
Okay.
Right? Like the businesses that have the positive greater than $1 retention rate are the ones where you're like, oh, I mean, they must be doing something good. Right? Because at least one of two things is happening. They're not losing customers, or their customers that stay spend more. Both of those things are some sort of vote of confidence.
Okay. And so then the question that I had is when we see the profitability of our cohorts decreasing the revenues generated by our cohorts over time, the reason for that is that the cost of acquisition is basically it's overpowering our dollar retention rate. Or is that not? Am I not interpreting that?
Well, I'm a little bit worried that maybe there's some. I just want to make sure that like you may have just misspoken on something. So first of all, I just want to make sure. Oh, okay. My share screen is frozen, but can you still see my little cursor moving around or not?
Okay. Yeah.
So let's just first be clear. The positive number, like these columns, are not revenue. They're income. So they're revenue times margin, right? So in terms of revenue, like revenues are going up because the company's growing. It's getting new customers, and it's keeping enough of its old customers, and they're not reducing their spend too much. That's why this growth is happening. Now you were talking about one thing dominates another, so I'm guessing you're like you had explicitly mentioned, CAC versus, bad stuff versus good stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Not income, exactly.
So this number is getting more and more negative, right? Because the CAC is important. So this number is high enough, right?
Right.
And because growth is happening rapidly enough, so that this bad stuff is more than outweighing the good stuff. So that's why that stuff is happening. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Any final questions, or I think we're good?
Yeah, I think it's time for a short break.
Am I remembering correctly? You guys are former lawyers, correct?
Well, lawyers to be, both of us.
Okay. So you guys are lawyers Wait, so how does this exactly work? So you guys,
but we haven't articled yet, so I can't call
Okay.
myself a lawyer.
okay, so it's kind of like been to law school, haven't done the bar yet.
No, I wrote the bar. Yeah, no, who wrote the
But you
Oh,
don't.
what does-
You have to do a stage to become a lawyer. You write the exam and then you have to do like.
Oh,
6 months.
is this a Canadian thing?
Yeah, it's a Quebec thing.
Oh, it's specifically a Quebec thing. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you guys are doing this program to have specific expertise in finance, and you guys want to do law stuff in the domain of financial services,
Yeah. pretty much.
or maybe just strip out the law and do the financial services.
Honestly, with every passing day, it becomes a little more appealing. But I don't know. We'll see. Definitely, I know. Definitely.
Every day, so it's
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, you guys are the first folks with the law degree that I think we've had in the MMF program, so that's cool.
much.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah.
It's actually helping a lot. I didn't expect it to help me like as much as it's helping.
Oh, the law background helping in this. Well, I mean,
Yeah, like
there's
finance.
definitely, I mean, especially like maybe even more in practice than in the classroom, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because like having that habit of like reading stuff and actually understanding it and paying attention to details and being systematic in your logic, not just in terms of I'll follow the numbers, but I'll make sure I really understand it, are like hugely important outside of the law profession. So I can totally see that. Noah, you had asked a little bit about research. So I've actually done some research that's kind of intersection of law, economics, and finance. So in particular,
Really?
one of the things I've written a research paper on is the use of vague contract terms in corporate contracts, namely outsourcing, licensing, and joint venture agreements between U.S. publicly traded companies and large contractual counterparties.
And what was like
So-
the
Yeah, so I've tried to document how common vague contract terms are, even in these biggest, most important contracts. I've shown that the usage of vague contract language increases when you have a more complex transaction, because it just becomes more and more difficult to like write everything in a precise way. So you use vague, I mean, you guys will know better than me, you use vague language to create a more flexible contract and allow, if necessary, a court to decide how to, interpret the vague language in a way that matches the ex post facts that are relevant to a transaction. So it allows you not to have to plan absolutely everything out in a complex transaction. So I've documented that, and I've also documented that when you enforce a contract in a higher quality court, because we've got like scores across different states and across different countries and how effective they are in commercial business litigation. More adept the court, more vagueness. And my interpretation for that is you trust that the court will enforce the terms in a more sensible manner, right? Because if you think a vague contract term is wonderful if the court enforces it well. If it enforces it nonsensically, it doesn't help things up front. So I've shown that as well. And then I've shown some relationship between vagueness and how often contracts get renegotiated.
And where did
Go ahead.
your contracts, did you just go on whatever was public? So you
Yeah, so the reason why I chose my sample is because it gave me access to a bunch of contracts. So in particular, like a challenge with any sort of academic research in contracts is like most contracts are private.
Yeah.
Right? And so you see two types of research in contract economics. One is research where the researcher takes advantage of like personal or professional connections that they have. Like, one prominent example is there's a researcher at the University of Chicago called Steve Kaplan, who's done research on venture capital contracts. And he's the person who developed the entire VC program at Booth, and they have a pretty prominent one. So he's well connected in VC, and he was able to get a lot of VCs to share their term sheets with him. So because of that, he was able to do empirical research on term sheets. the other approach is to hack a mandated requirement to disclose contracts. And it turns out for publicly traded companies in the US, they are required by the Securities and Exchange Commission to disclose their material contracts. So their most important contracts. And so what I did is I just took advantage of that and downloaded all the contracts that publicly traded company had to disclose, which I interpret as being their most important contracts. So I don't claim that my analysis says something about the entire universe of contracts in the world or among any type of random companies. I just claim that it's relevant for companies where it's, one side is US publicly traded, but it's a very important contract for them because they wouldn't disclose it unless it was material, meaning that the counterparty is a very large company as well.
Yeah. And
Have you,
I'm sure, like, just from what you're telling me, it also it does have a spillover effect on companies with contracts that you couldn't have achieved, because for sure, like companies use templates that they got all the time. So it's like, the company that you might have studied, it might have a spillover effect on 10 other companies.
Yeah, I mean, and these spillovers actually, I mean, I don't analyze the spillovers at all in my research, and I haven't tried to explore this. There's a bunch of things you can explore with data that's up to academic standard, at least, just because the data doesn't allow you to learn these things. But if I think theoretically about spillovers, there's a bunch of interesting spillovers. One is exactly as you mentioned, spillovers that occur because of the template channel, which is all about economizing on contract writing and negotiation costs. But there's also other things, there's spillovers that come from the fact that if I write if I put a vague term into my contract and it gets enforced in a court, it creates a bit of a standard on how that vague term for my type of company will be enforced in courts. And then once there's that clarity, other companies are going to have a better sense of whether they want to include the term or not, because they start to understand how it's going to be enforced. Does that make it good for their transaction or bad for their transaction, right? So the fact that I've put terms in contracts in the past, especially once they get enforced, creates other spillovers as well. There's a very famous US contracts case on vague contract term enforcement that was Bloor versus Falstaff Brewing. I'm not sure if you guys studied that in contract law, but so certainly in the US, if a contract law course has a section on vagueness, ambiguity, indefiniteness, sometimes the terms are used differently, they'll probably at least make sure they discuss that case. For contract law, I mean, I didn't study law, right? So I'm kind of the equivalent of an armchair lawyer. There's a law school professor at Columbia, at least he was at Columbia a few years ago, I presume he still is, called Robert Scott.
okay.
So he has some good stuff on vagueness in contracts, and he talks pretty prominently about Bloor versus Falstaff. And I think there's maybe you've heard of this book, Farnsworth on Contracts. I think it's kind of the most famous overview contracts book that doesn't overanalyze individual cases. So if you guys are interested in contract law, I would recommend at least checking out some of Robert Scott's work, but even more so looking at Farnsworth. Or if you guys have, once we can do the in-person, I'm more than happy to lend you the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you made any effort to try to quantify the costs associated with vague provisions, not in terms of how they're litigated, but just in terms of managing the day-to-day contractual relationship on the basis of a contract with vague terms?
So on the litigation front, I haven't done anything. Just because I myself haven't had the opportunity yet, at least, to actually collect data on what litigation of vague contract terms looks like, what its ex post impact is. I have taken, again, a lot of this is limited because I agree wholeheartedly that all the questions you allude to are important questions. For an academic, it's always like, well, there's interesting questions, but there's interesting questions that you can actually shed some light on. And so you need both, you need the intersection of those two things. And so it just turns out like there's a lot of limitations to what we can, and again, a lot of this comes from the fact that there's so much data that's not available. So what I can tell you that I've done is I've looked at how like the market reacts to the public disclosure of contracts that have more versus less vagueness.
Okay.
Right. So, but even that is like a difficult correlation to interpret. What you find is more vagueness, the companies tend to do better in the long term. There's a bunch of interpretations for that. One is vagueness is kind of good. Another one is that like the market is is very concerned about vagueness in a contract, so they charge a higher risk premium when a company is built off of vaguer contracts, right? So there's even like that's the thing. It's like this, you see a pattern. There can be many explanations, and the field, like the academic field, is kind of in the past 2-3 decades has really pushed towards like we really want research where you can disentangle those explanations. And so as a result, there's a lot of important questions like this that get under-researched in academia, because right now the name of the game is disentangling the possible explanations. Even if a pattern is really interesting and you can't, like if you can't disentangle, like referees for academic research are gonna like dump a lot of shit on it.
Right.
And so it becomes difficult to publish. And at the end of the day, it's the market, right? So just like businesses follow the opportunities that are rewarded in the market, academics do the same. They focus on research questions that they think are publishable or something like that.
Right. No, it makes sense. That's just something, that's a question that I think is fascinating, just because like Kat and I, like we're both planning on working in M&A, and like M&A, a big part of the value add that lawyers provide is like, we're going to anticipate the problems that could arise. And like by allocating that risk, like a priori, we're going to save you costs and like facilitate your relationship. So if you could quantify that relationship, I'm sure a lot of the partners at my firm would be very interesting to see that.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, so I'll mention like, someone could call it nerdy academic, but at the end of the day, it's fundamental logic. Is that there's like for questions like that, and it's not just for this specific question, but for just like a hugely general class of questions, is there's something called an endogeneity problem, which is it's tough to figure out the effect of a contract. Like, okay, like how much does adding this term in the contract add value to the transaction? It's tough to answer that question, because whether the term was in the contract or not is not random. So you can't just look what had the term and what did not, because it was put into the contracts it was put into contracts for transactions that are systematically different than the transactions where it wasn't put in. And so when you see a difference in value between the two transactions, is it because of the contract term, or is it because of the underlying differences in the transaction? Right? Unless you find a really clever way around that, it's almost like a circularity problem.
Yeah, it's like a chicken and egg problem almost.
Pardon me?
Like a chicken or egg problem. It's like, what came first, the egg or the chicken? Like, you just don't know. Like, did you put that in your contract because of the nature, or did you put,
Exactly. And that creates a difficulty to answer your question, which is actually a super specific question. And so like what we usually look for in academic research is like special cases where whether the term was included or not was random. Because if it was included or not randomly, then the difference in value is unlikely to be driven by differences in the transaction by the definition of randomness. But like finding cases where that statement applies is oftentimes a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
That like it's tough to find.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very like that research tends to be fairly opportunistic. It's like you find a quirk in the law or a quirk in regulation. Well, I guess regulation law, you could call it the same thing, or like a quirk in how companies behave, to try to spot some of that difference. And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Sound good?
Wow.
Good stuff. Happy to chat more about these things in the future. And if you guys are interested in doing like a thesis that combines elements of the law and elements of finance, don't hesitate to reach out to me, either to brainstorm or to give you my 2 cents on whether I think something is, some combination of doable and interesting. And that statement applies, whether or not you guys want to, do your thesis with me or not. So this is not contingent on, oh, I want you to be my advisor. It's like, if you guys want something in that area, I'd just be curious to hear. And I'd be more than happy to, hopefully by that time it's, we're able to do in person. So it'd be like a coffee chat or something. Because I think that's wonderful. I mean, I actually find the intersection of law, economics, and finance to be just super interesting.
Yeah.
My interest in doing all of this stuff stemmed from an interest in game theory and contracts. So.
Oh, okay.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely something I could see myself building. And on top of that, I think probably the area of finance that I'm most interested in right now is probably VC. So VC law, probably it's a nice match.
As I said, I'm going to give you guys a course on VC that takes both the startup and the VC perspective, and does have an entire section on term sheets, both thinking of it from a purely financial standpoint, how it determines how a pie is split between the different types of investors, founders, employees, etc., and also how how some of the terms in these contracts, are justified or work from an incentive standpoint in terms of correcting incentives, or sometimes even, worsening incentives. So we will probably more so than the other courses. There will be this component that, again, it touches on aspects of contracts and aspects of thinking about contracts from an economic standpoint more so than a probably a truly legal standpoint. That I can't even pretend with a straight face to be in a position to teach you guys.
All right.
Sound good?
Cool. Thanks a lot.
All right. My pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. So I guess, as I said, I guess we won't do the session tomorrow. We'll figure out a time to do it next week in terms of if you have extra questions, because I think, as you guys can probably see, there's probably value for you guys to spend a bit of time looking at this template before, so that you can be in a position to like come ask me questions and it's maximally helpful to you, or maximally effective. But in the meantime, good luck with, I don't remember exactly what you guys have on Friday. Was it a you guys give a presentation, or you guys are
giving a presentation? Yeah.
So hope that goes well. And also hope the preparation and actual eventual exam for Desmond's class go well as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Good afternoon. Bye.
Take care. Bye.